Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome to Let's Start Story on What If Harry Potter Awakened the Hidden Magic of Hufflepuff. So do 4 blue hearts comment, BS. You're to subscribe to our channel and like this video and please share with your friends and watch till end. Also check out Patreon for I have upload Harry x Ginny uncensored spicy version, link in description. Harry. Hermione yelled as she ran over the dark-haired boy. He looked up, sparkling green eyes widening behind his thin round glasses. Seeing his friend rushing up to him, he sighed and rubbed a calloused hand through his messy hair. Hey, Hermione, Harry sighed as his obviously excited friend flopped down next to him on the couch, positively beaming about something as she bounced slightly on the cushions. What is it? She grinned at him, her eyes twinkling mischievously. They put up notices about the Yule Ball today. Harry stared at her, wondering what this Yule Ball was. She misread his look and grinned wider. Anyone asked you yet? Harry jerked away from her. Wah what? He spluttered at her. What are you on about? What is the Yule Ball? And what would somebody ask me? Hermione's eyes widened. You don't know. The look on Harry's face must have convinced her. She began to giggle. Oh Harry. This is too good. Harry was getting increasingly annoyed at being left out. Some of the other students in the Gryffindor common room turned to look at them with curious eyes and Harry felt himself flush in embarrassment. Harry, you're a champion. That doesn't mean I know about everything. Harry snapped, losing his cool for a moment. Hermione quieted down, though still giggling slightly, and simply pulled a flyer from her bag. She smiled and handed it to Harry, who looked it over. Realization dawned on him like an execution date. No, he breathed. Hermione seemed to find his reaction tremendously funny as she burst out laughing and fell back onto the couch, clutching her stomach as tears of mirth rolled down her face. All the blood drained from Harry's face as he looked the paper over again and again. There was no way that he was going to go to this stupid dance to parade around in those dress robes Mrs. Weasley had picked out for him. No way in hell was he going to go out in front of the school to waltz around stupidly. I'm not going, Harry said, setting his face in a determined look and leaning back into the couch, crossing his arms as he glared at his laughing friend. You don't have a choice, Hermione giggled. The champions open the ball with their dates. What? Harry screeched, jolting up from the couch to stare down at Hermione, who had burst into laughter again. What? Dates? No way. No way in hell am I. You have to. Hermione interrupted him, grabbing onto his hand as she tried to compose herself, though still giggling madly. You have to go and do it. It's your duty as Hogwarts champion to represent your school. You have to do it. Harry knew Hermione was right. Reading the flyer she had given him had told him that he had to do it, no matter what. Feeling completely hopeless and drained, Harry slumped back onto the couch. But it seemed Hermione wasn't done with torturing him yet. So, thought of anyone to ask. Asked Hermione, practically leering at him. With a very annoyed yell, Harry threw up his arms in frustration and stormed off in the direction of the boys' dormitories. Hermione smirked as his retreating back. You'll get them tomorrow, she said to herself. Tomorrow, you won't know what hit you. They'll come in flocks to get the boy who lived. Harry stared at the girl in front of him. She was hanging her head and looked positively terrified as she shook slightly in front of him, her hands fidgeting in front on her anxiously. Said Harry, completely at a loss. Sorry, but, Harry hadn't even completed a coherent sentence before the girl let out a sob and sprinted off down the corridor, positively wailing. Harry stood in shock as he watched the girl leave him in complete confusion. Well done, mate, Ron said, clapping a hand on his best friend's shoulder, also watching the girl run away. You draw them in one moment and the next they're fleeing. Bloody brilliant. Harry scowled at him, finally returning from his state of shock. You know, I've never been very good around girls, he said dryly. What am I then? Hermione snapped, smacking her hands to her hips and pouting at Harry. A bear. No, said Harry, grinning at her. You're just not insane. And you don't spaz about every little thing. Ron burst into laughter as Hermione huffed irritably. Behind him, Harry heard somebody snicker. Turning around, he came face to face with Draco Malfoy. Potter, Malfoy sneered at him, a faint smirk playing about his lips. Harry glared at him. If looks could kill, the blonde would have been dead on the spot. What do you want, Malfoy? Harry spat at him, determined not to start a fight. Every fiber in him was flaring, wanting to lash out at Malfoy in any way possible. Nothing, the blonde said coolly, drawing back slightly and crossing his arms over his chest, smirking at Harry. I'm just enjoying watching you torment little third years. Honestly, I never would have put you as one who would do that. Harry actually growled at Malfoy's words. The blonde's silvery eyes widened slightly before snapping back into their usual cool stare. Shove off, Malfoy, Harry spat as he raised his hand toward the boy. Malfoy's eyes widened again, this time staying wide at Harry's actions. Doing something like punching or smacking Malfoy seemed to be the most inviting things that Harry wanted to do, but seeing as they were liable to be caught by a teacher if anything happened. Harry managed to surprise even himself as he simply raised his hand to Malfoy's face and flicked him lightly right in the center of his pale forehead. Malfoy flinched slightly as Harry's fingers hit his head lightly before his mask of usual calm dropped completely and he stared at Harry in complete disbelief, his mouth hanging open slightly. I'll pay you back for that comment later, Harry said, voice laced with anger at the boy in front of him. When there aren't as many teachers to stop me. Malfoy just continued to stare at the Gryffindor. Harry snapped around and began to stalk down the corridor away from Malfoy. Ron and Hermione scurrying to catch up to him. What the hell was that? Ron asked in complete surprise as he walked alongside Harry, face turned completely to the dark-haired boy. I didn't want a full-out brawl. All right, Harry snapped, not looking at Ron as he continued to stomp to Charms. Yay, but, shut up, Harry yelled, whirling on him, green eyes glowing furiously. He still felt all his pent-up anger and frustration from seeing Malfoy coursing through him and Ron's comments weren't helping his mood. Ron shrank away from Harry and Hermione gasped in surprise. A few other students around them stopped and stared at the fuming champion. A few of the girls whispered behind their hands, eyes fixed on Harry as he practically radiated anger. Harry, what's wrong? A familiar deep voice said from behind Harry and he whipped around to face the speaker, his anger fading slightly, though still pulsing strong. Cedric Diggory stood in front of him, looking perfect as usual. He smiled down at Harry, who felt his anger recede from him slowly. When he was finally under control of himself again, Harry sighed and smiled weakly at his fellow champion. Cedric's smile widened. I wonder if I might have a word, the older boy asked, and took Harry's arm gently. Slightly shocked by Cedric's gesture, Harry glanced at his arm in shock for a second before he was led away by the Hufflepuff toward an empty corridor. Whispers followed him and Ron and Hermione stared in disbelief as their best friend was taken from them by the 7th year. Harry followed Cedric in silence for a while before he was pulled into an empty classroom. As the door slammed shut, Harry became aware that Cedric was still holding onto his arm. Looking down at Cedric's gripping hand and back up to Cedric, Harry tried to silently convey the fact to the other student. Cedric smiled, seeming to understand, but didn't let go, instead pulling Harry towards him. Completely startled by this and being somewhat awkward with his arm being wrenched away, Harry yelped and, tripping over his own feet in haste, stumbled into Cedric. He heard Cedric laugh softly as he felt the strong vibrations in his chest. His head was now pressed against. He gave another startled squeak when his arms was released, only to find that 2 arms were wrapping around his small frame possessively. Cedric. Wah, Harry started to say in complete shock. Will you go to the ball with me, Harry? Cedric murmured, bending his head low to Harry's ear, and Harry felt Cedric's chest hum as he spoke. Shivering slightly from the close contact. What? You want what? Harry spluttered, trying to draw politely away from the 7th year holding him protectively. Cedric laughed softly again and brought his head lower so that his mouth was right next to Harry's ear, which made the younger boy shiver slightly. I want you to go to the Yule Ball with me, Harry, Cedric purred, his lips brushing against the shell of Harry's ear. I want you to be my date. Harry managed to push himself away from Cedric's chest slightly and looked up to find his face inches from the other boy's. He blushed deeply, feeling his face in heat at the lack of space between them. Why? He asked, completely at a loss of what to say. Cedric smiled and rested his forehead against Harry's so that their noses nearly brushed. He closed his eyes and sighed, arms pulling Harry toward him again. Because I love you. When I met you in Quidditch last year, I knew immediately I liked you. And since we have been in this tournament, I just fell, completely head over heels. For you. You're perfect, he whispered, opening his stormy gray eyes to gaze into Harry's emerald orbs. A light smile played about his lips as he continued to pull Harry to him. Harry felt like his face was on fire due to excessive blushing. Cedric, Harry tried to speak but was stopped in mid-sentence when the other boy lightly brushed his lips against Harry's, making the Gryffindor freeze. Eyes wide, and completely at a loss of words. Was that a yes? Cedric cooed at the boy in his arms, smiling kindly down into Harry's eyes. You'll go with me. I had hoped so. Without allowing Harry to respond, the brunette kissed Harry again, more passionately this time. Harry's mind was fogged, his eyes glazed over slightly as he continued to stare at the boy currently kissing him. He wanted to push Cedric away and ask him what he was doing. Harry felt his body grow warm and his eyes fluttered shut as he melted into Cedric's mouth. When Cedric finally pulled away and the feeling from the kiss slowly receded, Harry's mind slowly came back to him, his body still hot and face flushed from the contact. He looked up at the boy holding him and felt a slight tug in his stomach. And he knew this wasn't right. Cedric's smile faltered when he saw the look on Harry's face. What's wrong? Too fast? Asked Cedric, pulling back slightly to look questioningly into Harry's face. His gray eyes searching for the cause of Harry's discomfort. Harry shook his head and pushed at Cedric's chest, the brunette finally letting him go somewhat, though still keeping his hands on Harry's arms. I'm really sorry. Harry breathed, lowering his eyes, and he felt Cedric's hands stiffen on his arms. I'm really sorry, Cedric, it's just that, I dunno. He paused and looked up at Cedric, whose face, which had been glowing in happiness moments before, had fallen, and he was looking at Harry in apprehension. Harry had no idea how to explain what he felt. You, Cedric steadied High's voice by swallowing and taking a deep breath. You don't want to. That wasn't a yes. Without a word, Cedric shook his head and swiftly pushed past Harry, swiftly leaving the classroom. Harry watched him go, his stomach twisting horribly at seeing someone so hurt, because of him. Another person hurt because of him. Harry sighed and shuffled from the room. Suddenly Harry's thoughts caught up with him and began to race around his head, as if playing an ultimate game of tag. He had just been asked to the ball, and said no. On top of that he just has his first kiss. Wait, he had just been kissed. By Cedric Diggory. Cedric Diggory was a boy. Harry was a boy. Harry stood frozen. He had just been asked to the Yule Ball and been kissed. By a boy. And, Harry thought for a moment, it hadn't been all that weird. Harry's mouth opened slightly. What did this mean? What had just happened? Then Cedric's face floated back into Harry's mind, his words ringing in Harry's ears. That wasn't a yes. Harry groaned. Great, he thought. I've managed to hurt another person. What is wrong with me? He sighed and hung his head. And on top of that, he's a boy. Harry's mind was still having difficulty adjusting to this new concept. Shaking his head vigorously and groaning, Harry hurried from the empty classroom feeling confused and agitated. Harry, come on, tell us what's wrong. Harry glanced up across the table at Hermione's face and felt his stomach twist again. She and Ron had been pestering him, along with the rest of the Weasleys and some of the other Gryffindors all dinner, trying to figure out why he was so depressed and down since he had talked with Cedric. Hermione, obviously suddenly feeling very brave, leaned over her plate towards Harry and said softly, Is it Cedric? Did something happen between you two when he pulled you aside? Throwing up his arms in an exasperation, Harry groaned and flopped face first onto the table. Fortunately, he hadn't been hungry when he had come to dinner, for obvious reasons. And so he hadn't put anything onto his plate. However, this did mean that flinging himself face first onto the table meant banging his nose painfully against his plate. Harry moaned in pain and raised himself slightly to rub at his nose before letting his head fall to the table again, this time landing on his chin, somewhat painfully, but at least his nose wasn't hurting again. His new position also allowed him to look straight at Hermione. Whimpering, he turned his face back to his place, giving Hermione a superb view of the top of his disheveled black hair. Hermione huffed in annoyance, and crossed her arms. You're impossible, you know that. She scolded. Such a moody boy this year. I don't know how we put up with you. You and your hormones. I'm just Trying to help you with whatever it is that's eating away at you." Harry raised his head enough to glare at Hermione for a full minute, getting a glare equal to his right back. Still glaring at her, he got up, snatched up his school bag, and stood defiantly in the Great Hall. "I'm going to bed," he spat, whether at her or everyone currently staring at him, he didn't know and didn't care. Just as he was turning to leave, Harry's eyes flitted over to the Hufflepuff table and he saw Cedric poking at his food. Sighing, Harry walked out of the hall and leaned against the cool stone wall, closing his eyes and letting the back of his head rest gently against the rock. He let his school bag slip carelessly to the floor where it thudded dully, save for a light smashing sound, like breaking glass. "Shit," Harry muttered, opening his eyes and looking down at his bag. Black ink was seeping out of the bottom. Obviously one of his ink wells has cracked when he had dropped the bag on the floor. Grumbling to himself, Harry bent down to try to save his books and parchment from the black liquid. He was just pulling out his Transfiguration book when he heard swift footsteps nearing him. Looking up he saw Professor McGonagall sweeping towards him, her face the darkest he had ever seen it as of yet. Seeing him, she stopped and evaluated the scene before her. "Potter," she snapped, "I'd like a word." "You're the second one today to ask that question," Harry mumbled, his mind flashing back to Cedric as his stomach cruned guilty, as he picked himself from the ground and left his ink-splattered bag to pool on the floor. He'd ask Hermione for help later. But then, he wasn't talking to her. Harry scowled as he wondered why everything had to be so difficult for him today. He turned to face McGonagall and flinched at the intensity of her piercing eyes. "You, Potter, being one of the Hogwarts champions, ought to now know about the Yule Ball," Professor McGonagall said curtly. Harry nodded reluctantly. "You should also be aware that you and your date will be opening the dance." Harry nodded again, remembering Hermione's words from earlier that day. "You should also know that for the next week, all the boys and girls participating in the ball are to be taught dancing in the evenings." "What?" Harry blurted out, staring up at his professor in disbelief. "Dancing lessons." "Yes, Potter," McGonagall snapped, glaring at Harry. "Dancing lessons, which will be taught by Mr. Moody and myself. The boys and girls learn separately, to keep you all from being distracted." The Transfiguration Teacher was obviously not very happy with the idea of having to teach the Hogwarts boys and girls how to dance. "I am posting a message on the house's bulletin boards later tonight, but I felt that you, being one of the champions, ought to know. I was just on my way to alert Diggory as well." "Oh," was all that Harry could manage to say. "I'll let you get back to your bag then," McGonagall said swiftly, before turning and stalking into the Great Hall in the direction of the Hufflepuff table. Harry sighed and went back to his inky bag on the floor. "Bloody brilliant," he scoffed to thin air, roughly, grabbing things from his bag and surveying the damage the ink had done. Shoving his hand angrily into the bag, a shard from the broken ink well stabbed into his palm painfully and he hissed, quickly drawing his hand to his chest. He harshly pulled the glass shard from his hand, which began to bleed freely as the deep cut began to throb. "Bloody hell, this is just the worst day yet." Harry spat and growled as he threw the shard across the floor. The glass piece skidded across the floor, clinking lightly, before it bounced against someone's foot and was sent spinning to rest a few feet away. Harry looked up to see who had stopped the glass progress and met cool silver eyes. Draco Malfoy bent down, his eyes flickering from Harry's for a second as he picked up the piece of glass before they rose to meet Harry's emerald gaze again. "Is this supposed to be my Christmas present, Potter?" Malfoy asked, holding up the shard carefully and cocking an eyebrow at Harry. Harry growled from the floor, still cradling his bleeding hand slightly, as he glared angrily at Malfoy. The blonde smirked and pocketed the glass, taking a step towards the Gryffindor. Harry growled again and Malfoy paused, tilting his head to the side slightly. "You do realize that I am alone," Malfoy said loftily, shaking silky blonde hair from his eyes as he surveyed Harry. "No big thugs to flank my sides. Just me." His eyes suddenly darkened and his eyebrow furrowed. He was looking at Harry's bleeding hand and began to walk swiftly over to him. "You're bleeding." Harry stood up and rose to his full height, glaring at Malfoy. The other boy stopped in his tracks and scoffed, tossing his head again to clear his eyes of bright blonde hair. "Thank you, Captain Obvious. Anything else you want to share?" Harry spat. He was Till annoyed from the day's events and hadn't forgotten his vow to fight with the blonde. Unless you want the living shit beaten out of you, I suggest you leave. Now. Malfoy smirked at him, his blonde bangs falling into his eyes again, hiding his silvery pools slightly. Thanks for the present, he sneered as he strode proudly into the Great Hall, casting Harry a small smirk before he disappeared from the Raven's sight. Harry grumbled to himself as he muttered a quick cleaning spell over his bag and started to shove things back inside. Bloody git, he spat, the image of Malfoy's pale face drifting in front of Harry's eyes. His hand throbbed again and Harry winced in pain. He'd go up to the hospital wing later. Right now, all he wanted to do was go to bed and just try to sort out what had happened that day. Harry had sorted through a lot as he had lain on his bed, walked up to the hospital wing and back, and now felt that he had most things under control and in perspective. As he lay on his back on his four-poster bed, his now bandaged hand lying gently on his stomach, he went over the events of the day once more to make sure he hadn't left anything out that would ruin his current thoughts. The first thing that registered was that he had discovered, thanks to Cedric, that he was not as straight as he had originally believed. It was, perhaps, the most interesting thing he had known about himself since when Hagrid had burst down the door of that little sea shack and told him he was a wizard. He smiled, fondly recalling the memory. So, he was gay, or bi. He didn't know if he had totally given up on the opposite sex. But today with Cedric had certainly made things interesting. The second thing on Harry's mind was Cedric. He knew that he liked Cedric as a person, admired him even, but knew that he didn't love him. The tugging at his heart and insides when Cedric had held at him had told him no, he didn't feel about the Hufflepuff the way Cedric did about him. He was worried about the boy as well. Judging from the reaction he gave when Harry delivered his rejection, Cedric was not recovering well from it. This worried Harry, and even more, the fact that he could do nothing to comfort him. Seeing as he was the one who had started this whole mess. He felt so incredibly guilty about the boy's sadness that it was almost creating a dull ache in his stomach. The third thing was why had Cedric come onto him so strongly? Did he just radiate, "I'm a gay boy" vibes and not realize it? He hadn't even realized he was gay until being with Cedric, so why had Cedric done what he had? Harry furrowed his brow, remembering it. He supposed it was because, logically, if he fell for a guy, he would do everything he could to try to be accepted. The fact of whether he was straight or not was just a matter of being loved back, or even being accepted. Realizing this, Harry completely understood Cedric's actions. If the other boy liked him that much, he wouldn't have cared about Harry's sexual preferences and just done what he could to be accepted by him. It made sense. The fourth thing that was bothering Harry, which was what pretty much always bothered him, was Malfoy. But, instead of the usual plague he always was, recently he had been somewhat kinder, in his own Malfoy way, to Harry. Even tonight was evidence of it. He hadn't done anything to harm him, really insult him, or basically annoy the hell out of him. He had even almost shown compassion or concern when seeing Harry's hand. Harry didn't know the reason for this change in character, but he knew it was there. The final thing plaguing Harry's mind was this stupid Yule Ball. Not only was he supposed to get a date, but also dance and lead the whole thing. He groaned and rolled over onto his side, feeling somewhat tired. Sitting up and rubbing his uninjured hand through his unruly hair, Harry decided that sleep was an excellent solution for all of his thoughts. Sighing, he stood up and changed into his warm flannel pajama pants. Feeling slightly warm and deciding on not wearing a shirt for the night, Harry climbed into bed and lay back, letting his body sink into the bed comfortably. The thoughts of the Yule Ball and dancing didn't seem to want to leave Harry however, and they dragged back into his mind obnoxiously. This whole dance lessons thing was going to provide difficulties. Firstly, now that he knew he was gay, or bi, or just liked men, now he was going to have to figure out how to deal with his dance partners, considering McGonagall had said the boys and girls would be learning separately. Meaning he would be learning with other boys. Harry sighed and closed his eyes. On top of that he had to find a date. Whether it be a boy or a girl now really presented a problem. If he went with a girl, he might end up not having much fun, because all girls except for Hermione were complete flirts who just giggled and complained about their weight. Going with a boy meant that he would be a Announcing to the entire school he was interested in boys though, which would probably make Rita Skeeter's quick quotes quill explode in excitement. He was more likely to have fun if he went with a boy though. He understood guys. Seeing as he was one. Harry moaned and rolled over, staring out the window at the faint fall of snow which was drifting lazily past the window. Loud banging footsteps sound, dead right outside the dormitory door, and a moment later Ron burst in. "Harry!" the red-headed Weasley shouted, walking over to Harry's bed and sitting down next to his best friend. "What?" Harry said, slightly cross. Rolling over to look at Ron. "Come on, mate," Ron said, looking at Harry in concern. "Tell me what's got you all hot and bothered. I mean, honestly, you can tell me anything. I'm your best friend." He smiled weakly. Harry stared at Ron. "Anything, anything," Ron repeated, still smiling. "Okay," sighed Harry. "Don't say I didn't warn you. This is pretty weird, even by my standards. Any rather new. I still don't know how to deal with all of it and I'm just getting it all figured out." "Harry, spill already," Ron said, laughing slightly. Harry sat up, his sheets sliding off his bare chest. As he rested his back against the bed's headboard. "I got asked to the Yule Ball today. I know I was there. And I found out I'm interested in men." Ron stared at him, face frozen in a mix of surprise and amusement. Suddenly he burst out laughing, falling back onto Harry's bed as fits of laughter swept him away. "Shut up!" Harry yelled, his face heating, and he knew he was blushing furiously. Trying to keep at least some dignity to his name, Harry reached out and smacked Ron on the shoulder. "You bastard! I tell you my secrets and you laugh at me." Ron sat up, still laughing slightly. "Sorry mate," he said. Between a chortle. "It's just unexpected, you know." "So, how'd you find out? Who was it that asked you?" "I mean, we saw the girl, but I am guessing that's not who you're referring to." Harry averted his eyes, trying to look at anything besides Ron. It wasn't the girl. He sighed and leaned back into the headboard again, letting his head fall back to rest on the hard mahogany. "You know when Cedric came up and said he wanted a word." "Oh my God," Ron said in disbelief, staring at Harry, captivated by the shocking news. "Diggory asked you to the ball." "No way. What did you say?" Harry lifted his head and stared at his friend. This wasn't the reaction he had expected at all. He had expected Ron to stutter and go all red and become extremely uncomfortable. This cool and interested Ron was a bit odd. Ron noticed Harry's look and smiled. "Surprised I'm not freaked." Harry nodded. Ron chuckled. "It's not too weird for me really. Charlie told us a few years ago that he was gay. He's brought his boyfriend home once or twice, and I'm used to it. Bill claims he bi, but I think that means he's not sure. So go on, tell me what happened." Harry continued to stare at Ron. "What about you then?" he finally asked. Ron snorted. "I'm straight, at least, for the most part. I mean, I suppose I might be bi, but I mainly go for the girls." "Oh, so," Ron looked at him expectantly. Harry sighed. "Well, he led me away to this empty classroom and shut the door and pulled me into a hug." Ron was smiling wider than was humanly possible by now, an odd glint in his eyes. Harry shifted uneasily. "Then he asked me to go to the ball with him. And then he kissed me." Ron cocked an eyebrow and wiggled it obnoxiously. Harry, trying hard to hide his embarrassment, threw his pillow at the redhead, who dodged easily. "And then, what did you say? What did you guys do?" Harry stared hard at his friend. "You're pretty interested in this, which is surprising." Ron laughed. "Oh come on. It's not every day my best mate gets asked to the Yule Ball by a guy who is rumored by almost everyone in the school to be smoking. Or to put it better, flaming. Anyway, he's hot. Also, I just never get to hear about anything interesting here." He paused at Harry's expression. "Diggory's a fox, everyone knows that." Harry ran his hand through his hair, wincing when he realized it was the bandaged one. "Well, I tried to give him an answer, but he kinda cut me off." Ron stuck his tongue between his teeth as he grinned. "Oh, yay. How?" His mouth. Ron flopped down onto his back to Harry's bed. "Merlin, Harry, you obviously had some fun today. So why the hissy fit at dinner?" "Because I said no." Ron shot up and stared at him. "And he didn't take my response very well." "Hell," Ron breathed. "You turned down Diggory. Did I not emphasize that Diggory is a fox well enough?" Harry laughed. Ron swung around the other side of the bed, grabbing Harry's pillow and hurling it at the laughing bespectacled boy, who received the soft pillow straight in the face. But really, Ron continued. You turned him down. Why? Harry shrugged. It felt from the way he was coming onto me that he wanted more than a date to the ball. He told me that he really likes me. Ron was smiling at him, and not in the same way he had been earlier, but instead a real friend's smile. But, even though I was definitely enjoyed what he was doing, I just didn't feel anything at all beyond that towards Cedric. Ron's eyebrows drew together in contemplation. I mean, I agree. He is one of the best looking guys in the school. But I just didn't feeling anything, besides turned on that a guy was snogging the hell out of me and hugging me possessively. Ron grinned wickedly at Harry. Possessively, Harry smacked him with his pillow and Ron laughed, falling to the bed again. You're such a poof. Takes one to know one. Harry laughed, leaning against the headboard again. Taking a deep breath and smiling at the redhead. He said, damn, I'm one lucky guy. Why? Asked Ron, still lying on Harry's bed. Because you got snogged by the foxy man. No, answered Harry, glancing at Ron and grinning. Because I have awesome friends like you, who accept me for being the way I am, and crazy friends, like Hermione, who care about me. She's probably worried sick right now. He paused, swallowing as he looked up at the ceiling. Looking back at Ron, he smirked. And of course, for getting snogged by one of the hottest guys in the school. Ron smiled and stood up, walking over to his own bed and kicking off his shoes. Preparing for bed. So, he said, as he pulled off his sweater. Is he a good kisser? He looked over at Harry, blue eyes glinting. He wagged his eyebrows suggestively. Harry smirked at his best friend. I don't kiss and tell, he said, sticking his tongue between his teeth deviously. Ron scoffed and hurled his pillow at Harry's head. For the second time that night Harry was hit in the face and soon retaliated by starting one of the best pillow fights the Gryffindor boys' dormitory had ever seen. You should tell Hermione, Ron whispered into Harry's ear, causing him to choke on his orange juice. Sputtering, the raven-haired boy stared at his friend, who was frowning at him slightly. The redhead gave him a pointed look and jerked his head toward their bushy-haired friend. Hermione had been shooting concerned looks at Harry all morning and was now sitting sadly at the Gryffindor table poking unhappily at a plate of eggs and toast. Seeing her, Harry felt horrible for not talking to her, seeing as she was one of his best friends, but he felt extremely uncomfortable around his new self-discovery. Are you kidding? Harry whispered to Ron. It was hard enough telling you. I have no idea how she's gonna take this. No time like the present, said Ron cheerfully as he shoved Harry. Caught off balance, the raven-haired boy pitched into the marmalade and began to sputter. Hermione giggled and Ron started to laugh, pointing at Harry as the obvious culprit for his amusement. Ron, you get, Harry muttered, wiping marmalade off his face and cleaning his hands on a napkin. Hey, said Ron, I thought it was funny. Not my fault you felt like smelling the marmalade this morning. Ha ha, said Harry derisively, taking a glob of marmalade from his nose and smearing it on Ron's face. Hermione burst out laughing at this. Neville, who was sitting next to her, was rather red in the face, smiling broadly, and watching Harry and Ron's little episode with an extreme look of amusement. Ron laughed and wiped the marmalade from his face. Picking up his wand, Ron pointed it at his best friend's face and said, Scourgify. Instantly Harry felt the sticky goo on his face vanish and he was left feeling extremely bare and clean. He wrinkled his face a few times, trying to get the feeling back of it being normal. Ron grinned at him. Hermione seemed to have gotten a hold of herself and was now simply smiling at her toast. Glancing at his watch, Ron turned to Harry, smiling slightly. Right, he said, getting up and looking down at his friend. Best be off. I forgot my potions book in the dormitory. See you in hell. Finishing his statement, he promptly bounded off out of the Great Hall. Well, he's cheery for Snape's class, Hermione commented as Shish. He watched their ginger friend disappear through the doors. And I think that's the first time I've ever heard him refer to it as hell. He only calls it hell when he feels happy, Harry said, talkin'. Ga bite out of his toast and looking over at her. He smiled at her. Looking relieved, Hermione smiled back and scooted closer to where he was sitting so that she was practically sitting opposite him on the bench. Neville gave a small squeak of protest before sliding down the bench into Dean and Seamus. Hermione continued to look at him, now expectantly. Harry sighed and dropped his toast to his plate. I expect you want to know the story, he asked, tilting his head and giving her his. I know what you're thinking, look. Hermione nodded. Harry sighed again and stood up. Looking down at his bushy-haired friend he said, I'll tell you on the way to potions, okay? Fine, Harry, Hermione said, standing up and grinning brightly at him. The two walked out of the Great Hall together and, glancing over his shoulder as they left, Harry made sure no one they knew was following, or anyone at all, for that matter. Seeing the coast was clear, he sped up and, taking hold of her arm, pulled her along until they were a ways from any other students or portraits which could betray him. Looking down at his feet and sighing, Harry said, Okay, so, you know when Cedric asked me for a word yesterday? Yes, said Hermione. Harry glanced up at her before returning his gaze to the floor in his shoes. Well, he what? Hermione asked, somewhat impatiently. He asked me to the Yule Ball, Harry said, rather quickly. And clenched his eyes shut for the response. Hermione was silent for a moment. Harry looked up at her and met her shocked brown eyes. Cedric asked you to the ball, Hermione said, as if confirming it for herself. Yes, Harry said, deciding that she needed to hear the absolute confirmation. She was silent again for a moment, and he could almost see the machine whirling in her head to try to put two and two together. He was shocked however, when she just shrugged. So, what did you say? Asked Hermione, her eyes now glistening with interest. I mean, so, he's gay. That's fine. Did you say yes? Are you going with him? That would be so cute. Hermione, Harry said, interrupting her flow of speech. She closed her mouth obediently. I said no. Her face fell. But not before he snogged me. Harry added in a mumble. Hermione positively squealed. Cedric snogged you. Oh my god, this is too much. She was practically dancing now, her hair bouncing around almost joyfully. Oh Harry, why didn't you ever tell me you were gay? Because I didn't know until Diggory cornered me and decided to profess his love for me by attacking my mouth, Harry said, exasperated. Hermione stopped in mid-dance. Oh, yeah, said Harry. Oh, but why did you turn him down? Harry sighed, he seemed to be doing that a lot recently. Look, I just didn't feel the same way about him that he felt about me. He seemed to be looking for more than a date to the dance and I mean, I like Cedric, he's a nice guy, handsome too, but I just don't feel that way towards him. So that's why, said a deep voice quietly. Harry spun around to see Cedric standing a few feet away, cast in shadows slightly. That's why you said no. Harry felt his stomach clench horribly seeing the Hufflepuff's form and felt an irresistible urge to do anything to bring Cedric back to his normally happy self. Hermione, feeling awkward, backed away a few feet and left Harry to talk with the other boy at a distance. Harry wanted to reach out and grab her to keep her from leaving him alone, but at the same time wanting her to disappear and not have to watch what was happening. I'm really sorry, Cedric, said Harry quietly, looking the other boy deep in the eyes and trying to convey his remorse to the Hufflepuff. It's just, I don't love you. You're a wonderful person and I like you and all, but, I don't feel the same. By now, Hermione had disappeared down a hidden passageway and left both boys alone. Cedric looked at Harry sadly for a moment before suddenly sweeping over to him and wrapping the Gryffindor in his arms. You idiot, Cedric breathed into Harry's hair. It's not like I was asking you to marry me, I just wanted to be accepted by you. I'm sorry for scaring you. Harry sighed and closed his eyes, melting into the comforting embrace and wrapping his arms around Cedric. The older boy held him close and Harry felt so peaceful, so loved, so protected, for once in his life. He simply let go of everything and enjoyed Cedric's loving embrace. I'm so sorry for hurting you, Harry murmured into Cedric's chest. Cedric smiled and drew back slightly to look at Harry. Harry's heart leapt when he saw a glint of happiness in the other boy's eyes and a faint smile. As he had the day before, the seventh year rested his forehead against Harry's and breathed contentedly. I'm sorry if I was moving too fast, he whispered, nose slightly rubbing against Harry's. I was just so happy you weren't rejecting me, especially because of how I feel about you. Harry smiled and closed his eyes, relaxing with Cedric and feeling completely natural. Would you reconsider your answer? Cedric whispered, cracking his eyes and gazing warmly down at Harry. Harry opened his eyes and stared into Cedric's comforting gray pools. You don't have to answer right now, you can tell me later when you have time to think it over. I just really would like to go with you. Okay, murmured Harry, smiling up at Cedric, who grinned and pulled him to his chest again, sighing happily as he rested his head against Harry's hair. That makes me so happy, you have no idea, Cedric purred, nuzzling Harry's black mess and smiling. After a few moments of embracing happily, Harry pulled away from Cedric and smiled. Grinning at him, Cedric asked, would you dance with me at lessons tonight? We're OSED to start learning this evening in the Great Hall. Harry grinned back. Sounds good, he said, before turning and heading in the direction of potions. Turning around to look behind him, he saw Cedric walking away. A slight lit in his step. Laughing quietly to himself, Harry turned back to walk to Snape's room. Passing an old suit of armor, Harry received a horrible shock when he saw Draco Malfoy standing there, half concealed. With a look of complete shock planted on his features. The two boys then proceeded to stare at each other in complete shock and disbelief for a whole 5 minutes, mouths hanging open. And minds trying to climb back into reason and the real world, which they believed to have left some time ago. In the end it was Malfoy who broke the seemingly endless staring in disbelief contest. He blinked and closed his mouth only to open it again, supposedly to talk, but only managing a sort of odd gurgling sound before blurting out, "EGH, ah, you, and, ball, with shoes, and, butterbeer." Quote, it was the first time in his life that Draco Malfoy had failed to speak fluently and without at least 3 jabs at the subject included. As his mouth was randomly spewing nonsense. His brain was screaming at him, what are you doing? Get it together, man. Insult him. Insult him. However, this thought process did not seem to reach his motor skills. And his mouth continued to make no sense and his body frozen in dumb shock. The incoherent noise spewing from Malfoy's mouth seemed to have shaken Harry from his frozen state of absolute shock and mouth gaping. With a little shiver, he closed his mouth and blinked, trying to relieve his stinging eyes before he opened them again, hoping to not see what he thought he had seen. Opening his eyes and though he was met with what he least wanted to see. Malfoy, semi-concealed behind a suit or armor, mouth hanging open, and usual mask of cool gone to be replaced by a look of supreme shock and loss. Harry seemed to be so thrown by the sudden appearance of Malfoy that he actually lost his balance and stumbled back a few steps, shaking his head slightly. Malfoy, however, was still stuck in his own personal body-bind curse, now classified by him mind as dumb shock, and maintained his previous composure. Regaining his balance, Harry glared at Malfoy, expecting a full glare back and some sharp insult from the pale-faced Slytherin. Malfoy remained stuck, however, which greatly displeased Harry. To try to encourage some method of normalcy, Harry walked up to Malfoy and slapped him across the face, screaming, "What makes you think you can just spy on 2 people involved in a private conversation, you filthy snake?" The sudden sting across Malfoy's jaw seemed to have finally broken his trace-like shock. That and the force which Harry slapped him unbalanced him and he fell into the suit of armor, causing it to crash to the ground and create more noise than the Irish supporters at the Quidditch World Cup. It seemed that the combined noise and pain were finally enough to bring Malfoy back to his senses. Blinking confusedly from the floor among the suit of armor, he looked up at Harry. Harry was finally beginning to get his mind back, and discovered himself to be extremely embarrassed and irritated by the blonde sprawled on the floor. He glared viciously down at the Slytherin. Malfoy, and finally registering in his vision an extremely irate Gryffindor, scrambled to his feet and glared back as ferociously as he could. "What's up with you, Potter?" he sneered. "Or do you just glare at anyone who suits your fancy, and I have just been the ones who has fallen victim today? What are you doing here?" Harry spat at him, face burning in anger. Malfoy started and then paused, trying to remember why he had been in the corridor and hiding behind a suit of armor in the first place. Then he remembered and his eyes widened as he looked at Harry. "You," he exclaimed, pointing at Harry. "You." He seemed to be searching for words for a moment, but soon found them. "I just was heading to potions when you just happened to ruin my pleasant stroll by going all mushy in front of me with Diggory. And you make it all my fault for trying to hide from such a thing and try to preserve my innocent mind." At this Harry actually found himself laughing. Preserve your innocent mind, he gasped, hand on his side, trying to breathe. I don't think anything can preserve your mind at this point. You have never had an innocent mind. Malfoy reddened in anger and he glared at Harry. You're one to talk, he sneered. Going cuddly with a Hufflepuff. Then again, I suppose that is what you have to do. Deprived of love as a child, you search in others, regardless of who they are. The next thing he knew, Malfoy was back on the ground next to the suit of armor with his jaw smarting and Harry towering over him, breathing heavily and radiating fury. Don't, Harry ground out, teeth clenched along with fists. Ever insult my parents like that? Scowling, Malfoy swiftly wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, confirming a bleeding lip, and looked steadily at Harry. I didn't insult your parents, Potter, he murmured. I insulted you in your constant need of attention. Harry took in a sharp breath and stilled. Malfoy continued. For example, this tournament. Every year you go about all perfect potty and everyone loves you. Look at this now. You've become Hogwarts champion. Oh glorious day, I can't wait to see you become Minister of Mag. Shut up, bellowed Harry, burning within. Jeer as he glared down at the Slytherin on the floor. Shut up, shut up, shut up. Why can't you just shut your filthy mouth for once, you prat, and keep your nose in your own bloody business? The next thing he knew, Harry was throwing punches at Malfoy, who was slightly delayed in his retaliation of punches, but was soon fighting back with as much vigor as he could manage. All of the drowning emotions from everything Harry had felt began to pound through him. The tournament, Ron hating him earlier in the year, Sirius not being with him, the ball, his random dreams, his scar, Voldemort, they all flashed through his mind rapidly, fueling his rage as he lashed out blindly at Malfoy. What the FCK? Malfoy yelled at him, trying to defend himself against Harry. Fine, just go ahead and snap. It's not like you're the only one with problems. Oh no, we all have it easy compared to you. Screw you. Harry began to cry, whether in pain or in fury he didn't know. Teeth bared, face tear-streaked, body burning. Harry began to lose his accuracy and, before he knew it, his arms fell limp and he simply sat there, straddling Malfoy, who had also stopped fighting and was now watching Harry in complete disbelief. Oi! Malfoy yelled at him, face both annoyed and scared. Apparently having a crying Potter on his lap was not Malfoy's top choices of how to spend the afternoon. Frantically, he threw both of his arms and tried to push Harry off of him, growling in frustration when Harry simply leaned forward onto his hands, using his own force to support his weight. Clenching his teeth, Malfoy grunted in defeat. Removing his arms and simply lying there with arms propping him up, staring at Harry as the other boy sat, hunched in his lap, crying. Finally getting a hold of himself, Harry sniffed slightly, quickly swiping the last of his tears furiously from his face before looking up to glare at Malfoy. Glaring failed however when he saw Malfoy, lying placidly beneath him with his head dropped back, staring at the ceiling. His smooth pale neck almost glowed in the dark corridor and Harry could help but stare. It was short-lived however, as Malfoy seemed to realize that Harry was no longer a sobbing ball of wizard on his lap and he jerked his head up, an eyebrow raising when he saw Harry staring at him. Oh grand, Malfoy said, raising his head and looking at Harry. You've come back to the real world. Welcome home. Would you like a fruit basket? Harry sniffed in answer. I'll take that as a yes. Harry just stared. Look, if you don't mind, I'd like to get up some time today. Harry stared. So get off. Harry finally realized that the fact that he was sitting on Malfoy was actually not normal and scrambled to get off. In his haste he managed to completely tangle himself in his own limbs and fall over in a completely disorganized fashion so that he was half sprawled on top of Malfoy, flattening the other boy to the floor with a soft, UNF. Your genius never ceased to amaze me, Potter, Malfoy drawled. Groaning, he pushed Harry off of himself and sat up, straightening his robes. Harry scrambled to his feet and eyed Malfoy suspiciously. The feeling of Harry's gaze meant to have alerted Malfoy and he looked up at the Gryffindor. Harry narrowed his eyes. What's wrong with you? I detect no scathing comment. Malfoy blinked, then smirked. Nothing, Potty. I am just the plain old stinking Slytherin you always knew me as. Harry scowled. Then why was I not cursed into 1,000 pieces while sitting on you? Or has this become normal conduct between us suddenly? He took a step back and searched for his wand. Malfoy sighed. Relax, Green Eyes, I'm too tired to do anything that elaborate. So far, I find that simply calling you, Golden Boy, or, Potty, elicits the same amusing reaction that a simple wand gesture would. He smirked. Besides, the whole wand business is so troublesome, and mind games are much more entertaining. Harry growled. Who are you and what have you done to Malfoy? Malfoy actually laughed. He brought himself to his feet and fell into a graceful nonchalant lean against the wall opposite Harry. I'm Draco Malfoy. Same bastard you have known for 4 years. He smirked. Same, stinking Slytherin, same blonde boy, same pure bud, same stinking reality. Harry stared. What? Malfoy snorted and turned to walk away, glancing at Harry sidelong. And I see you haven't changed either, still slow on the uptake. Though I suppose that sob session was something new. Harry glared at Malfoy as he walked off, wincing slightly every few steps. Before he remembered what Malfoy had seen. Hey! He yelled, running up to the retreating Slytherin. What about you spying on me? Malfoy stopped walking and turned to face Harry. So Diggory is another fan who wants a piece of the famous Potter. Congratulations. I am so happy for you. The sarcasm obviously not appreciated, Harry settled for glaring. Malfoy smirked, his broken lip breaking again and bleeding slightly. Your lip is bleeding, Harry pointed out, unnecessarily, but silence seemed uncomfortable at the moment. Malfoy wiped his mouth and glanced at the blood. Wonderful. And make some daring story up about being attacked by a mountain troll or something and coming out victorious with only a bleeding lip. Harry stared. That was another thing that he seemed to be doing a lot of recently. Staring. We have potions, Potter, Malfoy commented, turning away and walking down the corridor to the dungeons again. He paused and turned back to Harry, smiling slyly. Want to walk together, Potty? He put on a simpering voice. I don't like walking alone. I need someone big and strong and heroic to protect me. Harry glared at him. Shove off, Malfoy. Malfoy shrugged. Suit yourself. This way is the fastest if you don't mind walking with a snake. Fat chance, Harry snarled. Malfoy smirked and turned and walked away again, briefly raising his hand in farewell and left Harry standing in the stone corridor. Still trying to understand what had just happened. Harry gulped. Snape was looming over him like a great overgrown bat, scowling. Do you think, he said, his ice slipping as if it too was covered in grease along with the rest of him. That because you are the fabulous Hogwarts champion who lived little boy wonder that you have the right to come to class late. Harry mimed a fish out of water in response. Snape sneered at him. In that case, 10 points from Gryffindor. A few of the students gasped and Ron let out a protesting sound much like an angered bird. And you'll need a partner for the lab. Let's see. The potions master glanced around the room, smirking. Ah yes, Mr. Malfoy. Perhaps you might feel kind enough to help Potter with his obvious superiority complex and lack of potion skills. Malfoy glanced up from his desk, met Harry's eyes briefly, smirked, and looked back down to his potions book. Well, as long as Mr. Malfoy is willing to cooperate. I think that you might try to take after his example, Potter, Snape muttered. Harry would have liked to throw a wet sponge at Snape, whether in anger or curiosity to see if the slimy man would run away from hygiene. He didn't know. However, he held his tongue and hung his head as he walked over to the desk currently occupied by Malfoy. Without saying a word, Harry dropped his bag to the floor and flumped down into the seat next to Malfoy, a prominent scowl on his features. Malfoy continued to pore over his potions text and paid Harry no notice. Still glowering, Harry looked up at the board to read what potion they would be concocting. Self-truth serum, he read aloud quietly, still scanning the board. Malfoy turned a page next to him and murmured, it reveals to the drinker who their true self is and what they truly feel. It can also identify who one is most attracted to, but that is only in rare cases and has only been recorded 3 times. Once by Alfred the Adulterer, once by Gradnos the Insane, and once by Tristan Carr, who committed suicide an hour later upon finding that his true love had died 7 years prior in a freak ox cart accident. Harry stared at him for a moment before leaning over slightly and whispering harshly, first you don't attack me and act weird and now you are turning into Hermione. Honestly, who beat you with the happy stick? Oh. Fun and games, or is this just some monthly phase one don't know about? Malfoy's eye drifted to the next page and he began to play with a strand of hair with his pale fingers. Firstly, you were sitting on me, he replied, still not looking at Harry. Also, would you rather I attack you? I can do so if you really want. He grinned and Harry glowered. You're the one who started all this hostility. After all, as far as I know you are just the boy who rejected my kind offer of friendship in first year. I wouldn't call that kind, snapped Harry, staring at Malfoy in disbelief. I would say more of snide and superior. Everyone's stupid when they're 11. I was no exception. Neither were you for that matter. Malfoy glanced briefly at Harry, but Harry was now glaring at the desk and picking away at the wood with his fingers and didn't notice. That's just the reality. What up with you in reality anyway? Harry asked, eyebrows furrowing. It what we live in, obviously, Malfoy said curtly. And to answer your third point, I have always been a good student. You were just too busy seeing me as a prat to notice I actually try in my classes. He glacked at Harry again and cracked a smirk. But then again, I could have always been beaten with the happy stick of fun and games and not know about it. He grinned at Harry again. Harry stared at him for a moment before realizing what he was doing and quickly recovering and sitting back in his chair and crossed his arms, looking darkly at the desk as if it had given him the scar currently on his forehead. Malfoy leaned towards him slightly. You know we are supposed to be working together. Harry glared at the desk harder, trying to resist the urge to pick up the piece of furniture and beat the pale boy next to him with it. To distract himself from the urge for physical violence via table smack, he leaned over and rummaged in his bag for his potions equipment. Potter. What? Snapped Harry, still rummaging in his bag, now looking for some parchment and a quill to scratch notes down on. Much as I love the view, drawled Malfoy. Could you please not wave your ass in my face like that? Harry, who had not been expecting a comment such as this, actually fell out of his chair straight into his bag and right into his Transfigurations book. He heard a snapping sound and, as he pushed himself upright, felt his glasses dangling from his ears. Already in an awkward and embarrassing situation, Harry felt his face reddening, and his mood was not improved by Pavarti Patil and Lavender giggling at him from across the room. Thank you, said Malfoy, not looking up but continuing to work on the potion. You broke my glasses, snarled Harry, dropping down into his seat, and glaring at Malfoy who was now only a pale blur next to him moving fuzzily. No I didn't, said Malfoy, turning towards him slightly, though Harry couldn't tell if he was looking at him or not. Your Transfigurations book broke your glasses because you fell into it. I had nothing to do with your glasses. Harry growled at him. I simply asked you to stop waving your rump in my face. I was not waving my ass in your face. Harry snapped, idling with the two broken halves of his glasses while still glaring at the fuzzy blot of Malfoy. I was getting my potion's ingredients. Shut up, said Malfoy quietly. How can you tell me to shut up? You little Mr. Potter. It seemed that Harry had forgotten that he was in a room full of other people and that one of those people was one of his least favorite people. Snape had glided over to them during the whole thing and was now looking down his hooked nose malevolently at him. Was all Harry could manage as he started up at the black blob that was his potion's master, who seemed to be radiating an aura of annoyance and anger at the moment. Since it seems that you are unable to work even when I ask you, Snape ground out between clenched teeth, it seemed that I have no choice. But to have you come in later to finish the assignment, seeing as I find it foolish to ruin another student's grade because of your arrogance. Snape turned on his heel and swept back to the front of the room to continue to watch the rest of the class for the remainder of the period, which was ending quickly. Harry gaped at the black blob of Snape and turned to Malfoy. Am I dreaming or did he just tell me to come in later with you to finish this thing and not fail me? You need 2 people to make the potion, said the pale figure of Malfoy as he packed up the workings of the potion he had been working on. I am not 2 people in case you haven't noticed. Or perhaps without your glasses you see double on occasion. I know you hate him, but Snape isn't completely unfair. Harry glared at the blob Malfoy. He's just letting off his favorite Slytherin student, like he always does. Malfoy sighed, closed his book, and turned to face Harry. Hold still, he drawled holding up his hand. And grasping what looked suspiciously like a stick of wood, also known as a wand, pointing directly at Harry's face. Harry froze rigid in his chair and looked at Malfoy in horror. "Reparo, the blonde," muttered, and Harry felt the two halves of his glasses which he was holding up by his face, fuse together. Bewildered, Harry looked down at his glasses, which still appeared to be fuzzy due to his poor eyesight, but which were obviously repaired. "What the hell did you do that for?" he sputtered, hastily putting his glasses on and staring at Malfoy incredulously. "Can't have you running into walls, suits of armor, or running up to random people and snogging them because you think they're diggory," Malfoy drawled, smirking slightly as he leaned back in his chair and watched Harry, whose face had just gone a lovely shade of magenta. "On second though, that would be extremely entertaining. Fall on your Transfigurations book again, would you? That'd be funny," he added, grinning. Sputtering indignantly, Harry stood up and glared furiously down at Malfoy, who continued to smirk up at him. "I really hate you, you know." Harry spat at him, before snatching up his books with a growl and walking jerkily from the dungeon. "Oi!" Malfoy called after him. "We have to do our potions lab that you interrupted today this evening. Meet here after dinner." Harry spun around to yell at the agonizing boy, to find the door of the potions room swung shut in his face by a certain sallow-skinned professor who was on his list of top disliked persons. "Potter, if you don't mind," sneered Professor Snape, turning smoothly to the dark corridor away from where the rest of the class was heading. Harry, feeling that his luck couldn't possibly get any worse, followed the potions master a few yards down the dark passage. "I don't know if you quite understand my intentions, Potter," Snape ground out, rubbing his head with his long fingers as if to relieve a throbbing pain. Harry stared at him in confusion. "The whole point in my pairing you with Mr. Malfoy was in an attempt to get you to learn something in my class." Harry gaped at him and Snape frowned. "Mr. Malfoy happens to be most proficient in potions and you could learn a lot from him. You paired with Weasley has done nothing but impede your ability and, as the Hogwarts champion, and one of my students, I will not allow you to continue this onward spiral that you have seemed to have taken as of late. I am going to pair up Weasley with Mrs. Granger. It seems that that might be the only way he will learn anything." Harry simply stared in shock as his professor as if he had never seen him before in his life. "What are you talking about? I thought you hated me." Snape laughed hollowly. "Oh, I dislike you a fair deal, Potter. However, I can't have you fouling up my class any longer and I expect to see some good results from your assignment tonight. If not, then I will be forced to go to the headmaster about your antics and lack of attention in my class." Harry felt himself grow hot with indignation. Before he could say anything, however, Snape brushed past him muttering, "That is all," and leaving him alone. A second later, he had vanished and the potions door opened and Malfoy strode out. Seeing Harry, he paused and smirked. Harry straightened up and glared at him. "Want to walk me to class, Potter boy?" Malfoy quipped, grinning at Harry. "It's good old care of magical creatures, you know. I'd rather not be attacked by another hippogriff." He mimed a terrified and helpless expression. Harry scowled. "You provoked him," Harry snarled, marching up to Malfoy. "And since when have you ever wanted to be in my company?" "Since I wanted to see people look in horror at two enemies together in the same corridor not killing each other," responded Malfoy. Grinning wider still, Harry raised an eyebrow and stared at him. "You're sick, you know that." Malfoy just smiled at him. "Any other reason you're being so sickly nice?" "Not really. Thought those facial expressions are pretty much worth it." Harry glared at him and he laughed. "Just consider it one less enemy at the moment, yeah. You can still hate me in public to keep up images and whatever, I don't care." Harry eyed him warily. "You seriously need to get your head checked." Malfoy laughed. "Without a doubt. So, what do you say? Shall we attempt a semi-civilized conversation on the walk to care of magical carnivores or what?" "Carnivores. An animal that feeds on flesh, Latin-based." Malfoy smirked at Harry's obvious displeasure at his explanation. "Oh come on. Hagrid's love of dangerous things is quite obvious. I am surprised we haven't been introduced to any Acromantula yet." Harry shivered, remembering his second year in Aragog. "You don't even want to know," he said with another shiver. Malfoy looked at him curiously. "I think the blast-ended Scroots are good for now. Think we'll walk them again. All depends on whether they can take us for a walk or not." Malfoy laughed and began to walk with Harry down the hall. They walked in silence for a few minutes. Some students passing by looked at them in shock and one or two of them actually stopped and stared. Little Dennis Creevey actually fell over. Malfoy, surprisingly, kept darting quick looks at Harry as he walked, Harry staring determinedly ahead. Suddenly Malfoy said, "So why did you reject my invitation on the first day?" Harry remained silent as they walked for a moment as Malfoy stared at him, waiting for his answer. Finally Harry replied, "You just seemed like a stuck-up pretty boy who wanted the famous boy on his side. And you were stuck up before then even." Malfoy gaped at him. "I didn't see you until that day on the train." "What do you mean before?" Harry smirked. "I met you when I was in Diagon Alley. You were getting your robes fitted." Malfoy's jaw dropped open so that it looked as if gravity was using every force to claim it. "It was you in there. I can't believe I didn't realize it. Wow. No wonder you wanted to get rid of me." Harry stared at him. Malfoy grinned foolishly. "I thought you were some kid from another great wizarding family. I mean," he paused and gesticulated irritably. "How was I supposed to know? The only other person I met that day was flaming Millicent Bulstrode. Let's face it, she's enough to put anyone on their guard, even Hagrid." "Har." Rai burst out laughing at this and Malfoy smiled a little. "I was trying to be impressive, I suppose." He sighed. "Didn't work though." "Not really," sighed Harry, lacing his hands behind his head as he walked. "You seemed like the biggest prat I had ever met. Well, except Dudley." "Dudley. You don't want to know." "Oh." Another pause. "So I was pretty much a prat from day one to you then." Harry nodded and glanced at Malfoy. "Shame," sighed Malfoy, stuffing his hands into his pockets and slouching slightly as he walked, which gave him a relaxed and eased look. Much different from his usual proud upright stance. "So I had already mussed things up with Golden Boy before I even had a chance." Harry frowned at him, pondering over his words. "Chance for what? Why do you always single me out?" Malfoy looked at him sidelong, smirking slightly. "Your reactions, they're brilliantly funny." "And because," he trailed off and looked ahead of him dazedly, smirk fading. "What?" "Nothing. We're late." Harry hastily removed his hands from behind his head and glanced at his watch to see they had under 3 minutes to make it out to Hagrid's on time. "Shit," he swore as both he and Malfoy broke into a heavy sprint down the corridor. Harry looked up at Hermione over his shepherd's pie, mouth half full and a look of confusion on his face. He swallowed his food laboriously and cleared his throat. "Hermione, I know that I'm in danger. I pretty much figured that out after I faced the Horntail. I can understand you're being worried but honestly, right now it's kinda pointless." Hermione shook her head, waving her hand dismissively. "No, no," she huffed, wearing a patronizing look. "I mean I'm worried about how Malfoy is treating you." Harry blanked. "I mean," Hermione elaborated, "that he's been acting strangely." At seeing the uncomprehending look on her friend's face, she huffed irritably and continued. "He's been acting so, well, friendly. It's unlike him. It makes me worry he's up to something." "Stop fussin', my own." Ron forced out over his mouthful of once appetizing food now transformed into repulsion as he joined the conversation. Hermione shot him a look of disgust at his speaking with such copious amount of food still half chewed. He hastily swallowed with difficulty. "I mean," he continued, his speech now clear due to the lack of obstruction. "You shouldn't be so paranoid. Right now, if we were being paranoid, we'd be testing this food for poisons, considering the circumstances. Stop being such a worrywart." Hermione shot Ron a very dirty look, huffed, grabbed her school bag, and marched off. Probably headed to the common room to fume as she completed her history of magic essay. Ron turned to Harry. "And she says you're the one with mood swings," he said, smiling slightly. "What time of the month is it? We should start recording and seeing if there's a pattern so we can be prepared." Harry burst out laughing at this while Ron watched his friend's reaction, smiling broadly. A light tap on his shoulder made him turn around and swallow his laughter in surprise, making him choke and cough. Malfoy waited patiently for Harry's coughing fit to cease as all the eyes of Gryffindor table turned to stare at the out-of-place Slytherin and Ron glowered at the pale boy. The sight of two house rivals who practically embodied the battle between the two houses in the same area. Let alone one of those people invading the territory of the other. "You going to live, Potter?" the Slytherin asked dryly. Finally having recovered, Harry straightened up and looked steadily at the young Malfoy. "Can I help you?" he asked coolly. "How polite," Malfoy said, grinning slightly before motioning for Harry to stand discreetly. "I was hoping that you'd be good enough to come and complete that potions lab we are supposed to do." Harry's eyes widened and his face reddened in embarrassment. He had completely forgotten about the lab he was supposed to do tonight. So much had happened today that it seemed to have pushed it from his mind. "You have to do a lab with the ferret?" Ron asked incredulously, gaping at Harry. "Yes, he does," Malfoy responded for Harry curtly. "And since when did you get off referring to me as the ferret? Think it's funny, do you?" "Yes, I do," Ron shot back, grinning obnoxiously. "It is very funny, Malfoy. You just have no sense of humor." Malfoy sighed in exasperation. "Whatever. Come on, Potter," he said, turning and indicating for Harry to follow him. "I want to get this lab over as quickly as possible." Harry got up, grabbed his school bag, and hurried out of the Great Hall after Malfoy as Ron scoffed behind him, returning to his interrupted mound of food which rivaled the diet of Mountain Troll. Once they were a little way from the Great Hall, Malfoy slowed slightly and heaved a sigh. "His remarks are really beginning to annoy me," the pale boy said heavily, turning his face slightly to Harry as he spoke. "Is he always that obnoxious, or is it just for me that he goes out of his way to antagonize?" "You're one to talk," Harry retorted, feeling it odd to be speaking so casually with his arch-rival. "It's not like you have drops of sugar dripping from your lips when you talk to him either. You can't blame him for it all." Suddenly he grinned, turning to Malfoy, who eyed his apprehensively. "Maybe his mind's just like yours, doing it for the entertainment, or whatever." Malfoy glared at him and chose to ignore his comment, instead replying to his previous statement. "Have I ever had sugar dripping from my lips, Potter?" "I don't know," Harry mused, smiling slightly as he looked at Malfoy. "I've never seen you in a situation where that would be the case. I imagine it'd be quite a sight to see though. I think that likeliness of that is about equal to you asking Gilderoy Lockhart to adopt you," Malfoy said, grinning broadly at Harry as they turned down the corridor to the potions classroom. Harry shuddered. "Now I remember why I hate you so much," he grumbled, the disturbing memory of Lockhart still flashing in his mind obnoxiously. "Because you constantly remind me of things which make me feel like kicking in a door or vomiting convulsively." Malfoy laughed and opened the door to the potions classroom. Snape was waiting for them there, seated at his desk and reading what appeared to be a stack of SAYS for grading and with a small plate of food beside him. Hearing the door open, he looked up and, catching sight of the two boys, sighed, placed the essay he had been reading, and stood up, swiftly, walking over to them and closing the door behind him. "Well," Snape said, running a hair tiredly through his greasy strands. "You two certainly took your time getting down here. I believe I told you to come down exactly after dinner." "You did, sir," Malfoy said, walking over to a nearby desk, and beginning to remove the necessary equipment from his bag. "It is, in fact, however, the middle of dinner. I believe your clock is fast by at least 20 minutes. I noticed that when I came in after care of magical creatures to remind you that you have to supervise the dancing tonight because Moody obviously can't dance very well, due to his..." He paused for a moment before concluding, "injury." Snape's face seemed to become even more sallow at this and his scowl more prominent. He took a moment before recovering back into his normal composure and glancing at the clock. "Very well. Get to work. I expect you two to have finished before the frivolity tonight," he said, obviously meaning the dancing lessons. At which Harry internally scowled and groaned at, remembering that he was going to have to learn to dance tonight. Snape, not paying attention to Harry or Malfoy, resumed his position reading the essays at his desk and occasionally picking at his plate of food. Sighing at seeing his head of house's neglect to change the clock, Malfoy briefly raised his wand, aimed it at the clock, and the hand zoomed back to rest on the correct time, before resuming to remove the necessary materials from his bag. He looked up at Harry. "Are you planning on just watching me or am I going to get some help in this?" he asked, pausing for a moment in removing his scales from his bag. Shaking himself slightly, Harry walked over to the desk Malfoy was occupying, now setting up the cauldron and removing the necessary ingredients. Harry opened his potions book to the appropriate page and read. Halfway down the page, he looked over to Malfoy, who was beginning to cut up ingredients. "Are we going to have to test this?" he asked, trying to mask his anxiety about doing so. "Yes," Snape replied from the front of the class, looking over to them. "Since you two were so intent on making a disturbance, you missed the fact that if your potion is deemed safe, you will be testing it. Under supervision, of course." Harry blushed. He didn't think he would really enjoy blurting out his secrets and the person he was most attracted to in front of his least favorite teacher and rival. The idea made his stomach churn unhappily. He gulped. "Oh. In which case," Malfoy said, pausing as he finally crushed up Grindylows' spines. "I would hope that you would work with me and try to actually create a decent potion." He gave Harry a meaningful look. Meaning get to work. Now, not wanting to be the subject of that voice any longer, Harry quickly pulled out his own potion's ingredients and began to work. Within half an hour, he and Malfoy had managed to prepare a cauldron full of a lightly steaming substance, which was slightly opaque and a vague icy blue. Malfoy was scanning the book and Snape had stopped his grading to evaluate the potion at a distance for a moment. "Well," said Malfoy, his eyes jumpy. "Ing from the potion to the book and back again. It looks like it says it should look, and I can't think of anything we've done wrong. What do you think, Professor?" In answer, Snape stood up, swept over to the two boys, and handed each a small beaker, saying only one word: "Test." Harry gulped. Suddenly, he dearly wished that he hadn't done a good job with Malfoy and succeeded in creating the potion. He watched Malfoy dip in the ladle they were using and put a small amount of the potion in the beaker, a slightly look of reluctance on his face. He handed Harry the ladle without looking at him. Harry, hands slightly shaking, managed to ladle some of the potion into his own beaker before he looked up at Snape, wishing that the potion's master would suddenly become extremely uncharacteristic and laughed, telling them he was only kidding. Snape, however, maintained his composure and simply nodded at the two boys. Taking a breath, Harry brought the beaker to his lips, watching as Malfoy mirrored him out of the corner of his eye. Closing his eyes, he quickly swallowed the substance as quickly as he could. Surprisingly, it didn't taste all that bad, somewhat like maple tree sap before it had been boiled down for syrup. However, it was feeling it travel down which made Harry shiver, as it felt a little cold and icy and left his throat tingling. He looked over to Malfoy and saw the pale boy wore the same expression Harry imagined was on his own face. "That was weird," the Slytherin remarked, indifferently. Harry opened his mouth intending to agree with the blonde, but instead he heard himself say something completely different. "I am an emotionally imbalanced youth with an identity crisis and sexual preference issues, as well as maintaining a constant hatred of my supposed destiny. Most of these things are due to my lack of good parenting and early childhood neglect." Snape stared at him. Malfoy looked like he was about to laugh. Harry quickly clapped his hands over his mouth in shock as his face reddened in embarrassment. After a moment he opened his mouth, supposedly to respond to his outburst. However, he seemed to now be experiencing what Harry had just done. "I have a superiority complex and an extreme case of self-hate and depression, as well as issues of empowerment and perfectionistic qualities stemming from an abusive childhood and high expectations due to pureblood status. I am horrible at expressing myself and, in an effort to try to be accepted, force myself onto people and result with the social image of a bully, which I internally despise. I love." Before he could finish, Malfoy, who had been going redder and redder at every word coming from his mouth and positively blanched at his last interrupted statement, quickly slapped both hands over his mouth forcefully to stop himself from blurting out his last statement. The energy was a bit excessive, seeing as he managed to nearly unbalance himself and fall out of the chair as his mouth kept on spewing information behind his hands, as if determined not to stop. Snape was watching both boys with supreme interest and what could have been called amusement, except Harry knew that his teacher lacked any sense of humor at all. Harry was watching Malfoy struggle against his mouth in shock. It seemed his mouth refused to allow him to keep the last statement from being heard, and it looked as though he was fighting with himself, thrashing slightly in his seat. The next moment, Harry was speaking again, and he was horrified at what was coming out of his mouth. "I have extreme difficulty in finding anyone who appeals to me. Due to a firm belief established as a child that I am unlovable and unworthy of any affection, which makes me deny anything which would even remotely be described as love. However, recently, I have been confused in many regards with the recent situation of the Yule Ball, to which C.E. It was Harry's turn to clamp his hands over his mouth. Having Malfoy know about him and Cedric's confusing, whatever it was one thing, but to have one of his professors, let alone Snape, know, was absolutely horrifying. Therefore, he was now experiencing exactly what his opposite was wrestling with. His mouth seemed to have gained its own personality, and, aided by portions of his body, was trying its best to yell his secrets for the world to hear. Snape seemed to be enjoying the spectacle before him. My, he said, smiling slightly, although, according to Harry, that was impossible. Well, this is certainly much more entertaining than I had expected it to be. No one has yet before come to the point of admitting their attractions. Malfoy shot an angry look at the potion's master, still struggling with his mouth. Harry found himself copying the blonde and glaring daggers at the dark-haired man. I must admit, it is quite interesting to see. However, if you two are going to spurt love stories, I might as well leave you to it. And in a complete shift of character, he walked to the door leading to his office at the back of the room and disappeared through it, leaving both boys staring horrified at the now closed door. The fight with mouths seemed to be intensifying for both Harry and Malfoy. Seeing as Harry was finding himself nearly jolted from his seat, and it looked as if Malfoy was just as bad. Suddenly, the blonde wrenched so violently that he was thrown into Harry, knocking them both to the floor. As he hit the floor, Harry's hand flew away from his mouth and, instead of words, he belched loudly. Malfoy didn't seem to have survived the fall as well as Harry did. His face was paled to a degree that wasn't humanly possible and he looked petrified. Harry didn't blame him, seeing as he was feeling pretty awkward himself with the blonde practically lying on top of him. Maybe this was how Malfoy had felt when Harry has been sitting on him. Eyes widening, Malfoy lurched to the side away from Harry and promptly vomited all over the floor, coughing. Harry tried to sit up to help a Slytherin. Who would have thought, but found it rather difficult, due to the fact that Malfoy was still sprawled on him for the most part. Therefore, all he could do was wait and watch as Malfoy steadied himself on shaky arms, still coughing occasionally, and regained him balance enough to move away from the pile of sick, wiping his hand on his sleeve, to collapse. To Harry's surprise and embarrassment, the blonde collapsed back onto him. Harry said awkwardly, caught between patting Malfoy and touching him and keeping his arms on the floor as they were, causing him to show an odd sort of waving with his upper limbs as he lay with the Slytherin on top of him. Malfoy. Malfoy ground out, eyes squeezed shut, trying to keep out noise and anything. After a moment he blearily opened his eyes and blinked dazedly at Harry as if not recognizing him before saying, "Sick. Hospital. Bed," and promptly passing out on top of Harry. Harry, already wide-eyed, simply stared in shock as the blonde lay unconsciously on top of him. After a moment and a bit of struggling, he managed to push the blonde off of him for the most part so he could sit up. Taking out his wand, he pointed it at the pool of sick and said, "Evanesco," making it disappear instantly, before he dragged Malfoy to a sitting posture and leaned him against the wall. Harry crouched down and, using one of the cloths from the cabinet behind him, wiped Malfoy's face of whatever remnants there were of sick. He felt odd being so kind to the Slytherin rival, but at the same moment felt he had to do it. Snape had left and no one else was here to take care of him. He couldn't just leave him here for someone to stumble across tomorrow morning. Well, he could, but that was just low. Sighing, Harry placed the cloth aside. Having finished getting all of the sick from Malfoy's face, and absently brushed the hair from Malfoy's face. It was odd, but Harry was just now having a hard time seeing how he and the other felt so strongly towards each other and always fought. Right now, as Harry watched his face, Malfoy looked so calm, peaceful, and fragile. It was nearly impossible to see as the snide commenting prat that he was usually. In fact, right now, Harry felt like Harry's thoughts were shattered as Malfoy moved and groaned, causing Harry to freeze as he watched the pale boy awaken. Slowly, Malfoy opened his eyes and, once gaining focus, settled on Harry and widened. Harry seemed to have been immobilized and didn't move as Malfoy stared in shock at the Gryffindor in front of him. He also didn't fail to notice the hand hovering right next to his face. After a moment or two he licked his lips and stuttered, Potter. What? Harry seemed to have been slapped fro. His state as soon as Malfoy had begun speaking and jerked back violently, interrupting Malfoy as he spoke, a confused and shocked look on his face. Malfoy looked at him in surprise, not expecting the reaction Harry had given. The two boys stared at each other for a moment, neither speaking, before finally looking away. Harry hastily pushed himself to his feet and then, when Malfoy seemed to have slightly difficulty getting up, offered a hand, which was gladly accepted, and pulled the blonde to his feet. "Thanks," Malfoy said, eyes hidden by his pale bangs as he scuffled over to his bag to begin packing things up. Harry said nothing and instead began to hastily shove things into his bag as well. When they had both finished putting their things away, Harry stood awkwardly staring at the CK board as Malfoy fiddled with the buckles on his bag as if they were the most fascinating things in the world. Harry looked over at Malfoy sharply, surprised when a pair of stormy eyes rose to meet his at exactly the same moment. Harry spun around as he was halfway across the front hall, still in a hurry to get to the common room to face Cedric as he walked to the Great Hall. It took a moment for him to respond, seeing as he was slightly out of breath. "I'm just on my way to, he trailed off, having no idea how to end a sentence that didn't make sense to even him. "I have no idea," he finished, slightly bemused. Cedric laughed slightly before walking over to the out-of-breath Gryffindor and taking his bag for him, at which Harry blushed and gave him a surprised look. "In that case, still up for being dance partners with me?" the tall seventh year asked, his eyes glinting warmly. Harry mentally smacked himself in the face. He had completely forgotten about the dancing practice that night in lieu of the time spent in the potions classroom. He flushed even deeper in embarrassment and Cedric grinned sweetly down at him as he took his hand and led him into the Great Hall where the boys would be practicing. Just before they walked through the doors, Cedric leaned down close to Harry's ear and whispered, "You're really cute when you blush." Of course, at this Harry just blushed even more. 1. Because he was being complimented by an extremely handsome boy who was whispering seductively into his ear. 2. Because he was being called cute, which he didn't usually associate himself with being, seeing as it was what he would think of as being for girls. Just as they were waking through the door, Cedric released Harry's hand, gave him a wink, and the two walked into the hall. Harry felt slightly shocked at first but then realized it was because Cedric didn't want to make him awkward by immediately presenting them as a couple or something like that. Harry silently thanked Cedric as the two of them separated and Cedric went to go join his friends and Harry wandered over to find Ron and the rest of the Gryffindors. "Oi!" Ron yelled, seeing Harry and pushing his way through the crowd to get to his best friend as Harry turned to try to find where the redhead's voice had come from. Upon spotting Ron he smiled and walked to meet him. "Where have you been?" Ron demanded, finally reaching his best friend. "Potions lab," Harry replied, not wanting to go into details about his experience there. "The potion took longer than I expected it to. And then we had to test it so." Ron gave him a bemused look. "You guys actually tested it?" he asked, amusedly. "No one really had a good enough potion. Hermione would have if I hadn't mussed it up." "So how was that?" At that moment Professors Moody, Snape, and McGonagall entered and Moody's loud gruff voice bounced off the walls like 100 super balls, making everyone jump and Harry incredibly grateful he didn't have to answer Ron's question. "All right you lot," roared Moody, clunking purposefully to the center of the hall, his magical eye swiveling as usual. "Get your partners fast or I'll turn you all into a bunch of ferrets." "Professor!" McGonagall shouted indignantly at Moody's words as the scarred man laughed while the boys hurried to grab a partner. Harry, as he craned his neck to try to catch sight of Cedric, caught sight of Malfoy's blonde streak of hair as he hurried into the hall and disappeared into the mass of boys frantically pairing up. He jumped as he felt two strong arms wrap firmly around his waist. "Found you," Cedric purred into his ear. A few of the boys around them stared for a moment before looking for a partner again. Harry quickly spun in Cedric's arms and looked up at the grinning Hufflepuff. He couldn't think of anything to say and so just smiled up at Cedric in what he hoped was a convincing fashion. He was beginning to feel a little awkward being so cuddly in front of everyone. Cedric's grin widened and he pulled Harry slightly closer to him. Moody's voice echoed out again over them all a moment later. "All right, if you don't have a partner, grab the nearest free boy." Those paired moved to the sides. The crowd of boys all shuffled off to the sides hurriedly to reveal Moody and McGonagall in the center of the hall. Snape had taken his post at the Great Hall's doors. Probably to keep anyone from running away. Moody was leering around at all of them while McGonagall had her head in her hand, shaking it woefully as if finding this whole thing absolutely ridiculous. Harry silently agreed with her. "Champions!" Moody bellowed, making everyone jump. "Out here! Pronto!" Harry felt himself being pulled into the center of the floor by Cedric's arm and, glancing over, saw Crumb hurrying to the floor dragging a frightened-looking Ravenclaw Harry recognized as Terry Boot from his year behind him. Silently he wondered if all the champions were set gaze a moment before he was hauled to a stop in front of a maliciously grinning Mad Eye and an exasperated McGonagall. "Good men," Moody gruffed out, still grinning. "Sevi," he yelled, turning his face toward Snape. Harry didn't have to look to know that Snape had a look that could kill on his face. "Put on that music, boy." It seemed that Snape felt that arguing would be completely fruitless though, seeing as a moment later, a scratchy waltz began to play around the hall. "Now," barked Moody, prodding at McGonagall. "I want you to watch us as we demonstrate what to do." McGonagall had a horrified look on her face. Her eyes darting to Moody's fake leg in terror. Professor," she interjected. It was the first time Harry had ever seen her look this uncomfortable and flustered about something. Might it be a better idea for Severus to demonstrate? Moody paused in his preparing to take a position he seemed to think was one appropriate for waltzing before straightening up, grinned back in place, and saying, "You know, I rather like that idea. I'm sure Severus has more waltzing experience than I do. Severus, get over here. Teach these prats how to dance." From the grudging steps Harry heard echoing on the floor. It seemed Snape liked the idea of dancing about as much as he liked doting on Harry. Moody walked noisily over to the place Snape had vacated at the door and watched as Snape took McGonagall's hand emotionlessly and the two began to dance. Harry looked in shock as Snape and McGonagall swept around the hall in time to the music, all the while Snape monotonously counting out, 1, 2, 3. To make sure the boys understood the timing of the music and the foot movements. After a minute or two, Snape and McGonagall stepped apart and walked up to the four boys in the center of the hall. "Your turn," Snape said curtly. Cedric didn't need asking twice. Before Harry knew what was happening, Cedric had gently grabbed his hand and was moving him away in a waltzing motion around the hall in time with the music. Harry, caught off guard and not knowing what on earth to do, began to trip over his own feet and squeaked. Cedric leaned down to him and murmured, "Listen to the music and move with it. I'm leading, so just follow me. Don't worry." Harry did as he was told and began to feel himself ease into the movements and rhythms Cedric led him along to. Feeling more comfortable, he looked up at his partner to be met with warm gray eyes gazing endless down at him. He blushed again, feeling self-conscious, and Cedric smiled gently, leaning down slightly. "You're doing beautifully as well as looking it. Enjoying yourself." Not trusting himself to speak, Harry simply nodded and smiled up at Cedric as they continued to waltz around the hall. It took a moment for Harry to realize that more people had joined the floor, and he was surprised when a couple passed by them and one of them whispered to Cedric, "Graceful as always, Seed." Cedric nodded and smiled in return as the boy and his partner passed. Harry looked around at all the other couples. Crumb and Terry Boot seemed to be doing pretty well, stumbling only now and then. Dean and Seamus moved awkwardly, stepping on each other's feet every so often. Ron was attempting to dance with Neville and the two were failing miserably. Fred and George were, of course, being overly dramatic and enthusiastic as they spun around the hall theatrically, dipping and twirling unnecessarily with comically theatrical expressions as they hummed along with the music. Harry couldn't help laughing slightly as they passed and Fred winked as George fake swooned. Harry was definitely beginning to feel much more comfortable with this whole waltzing business as he was drawn about with Cedric, moving nicely in time with the music. And then the music stopped. The pairs stopped moving, and Moody's gruff voice boomed out again. "All right, enough of that. Get to bed and rest up for tomorrow." Harry drew away from Cedric and Dee let his arms drop as he looked up at Cedric. Well, he started, not entirely sure how to finish. That was really great. Thanks a lot, Cedric. He smiled at the tall boy. Cedric smiled warmly down Harry and gently took his arm as the group began to walk out of the hall. Unnoticed in the crowd, Cedric slipped his warm hand into Harry's, making the raven-haired boy blush slightly. Cedric's grin widened as they continued to walk. When they were clear of the Great Hall and everyone was heading off to their respective dorms, Harry turned to Cedric, not quite sure how to say goodnight. However, before he could say anything, Cedric squeezed his hand and asked softly, "Would you like me to walk you to your common room?" Slightly surprised by this, Harry began to stammer. Well, sure. But, you don't know where." Cedric laughed softly, cutting Harry off. "I'll let you lead on this one," he murmured, his deep voice purring making Harry shudder slightly and feel slightly warmer. "Oh," Harry said, lost for words and blushing foolishly. "Okay." And he began toward the staircase to the Gryffindor common room with Cedric holding gently onto his hand as they made their way. Harry had barely closed the dormitory door before he was assaulted by 3 ginger blurs and 3 equally heavy bodies all belonging to a Weasley. Surprised, he stumbled back and fell against the wall from the impact and flailed his arms helplessly. "Where have you been?" Ron practically yelled at him, revealing to be the middle blur of orange hair staring straight into his face, eyes alight with concern, interest, and annoyance all at once. "I've been waiting for ages to hear about how dancing with the fox was." The twins, who had been the 2 other orange blobs attacking Harry, burst into laughter at Ron's words and had to hold on to each other for support. "Fox," George wheezed out. "Since when did you," Fred started. "Refer to anyone," continued George, "as a fox, ickle Ronnie Kins." Fred finally finished. Ron flushed red to the roots of his hair. "Why are you 2 here anyway?" he snapped, trying to change the subject. Fred and George both split into equally mischievous grins and looked to Harry. Suddenly moving so quickly Harry couldn't react so that they were standing on either side of him, leering down at him. They each took one of Harry's hands and began to waltz him awkwardly around the dormitory, singing horribly the tune they had been waltzing to earlier that evening as they swung Harry around. "Has he swept your heart away?" Fred crooned as he swung on Harry's arm. "The Prince of the Castle." George continues the ridiculous song with his twin. Eyes so deep and stormy gray, Fred raised an arm as he jumped octaves. "The champion whom you danced with tonight." George finally finished with a flourish before both he and Fred collapsed onto Harry's bed, pulling the raven with them and finishing their ridiculous repertoire by planting overzealous kisses on each side of Harry's face with a loud, "Mwah." Groaning, Harry pushed the twins away, who were smiling evilly and as if they felt very accomplished. He looked at Ron, scowling. "Did you tell them?" Ron looked affronted. "Wah, no. Why would I tell them?" Quote. The twins just laughed and rolled off the bed as Harry sat up. "We didn't need to be told anything," George said, leering. Fred grinned, draping an arm around his twin. "Yeah, the way you 2 were practically floating around the floor made it pretty obvious." Harry blanched and Ron, in his defense, half yelled, "That's a bit of an overstatement. They just could dance well." George laughed. "Maybe. I suppose it might also be that we have excellent gaydar." He and Fred leaned into Harry's face grinning identically. "Well, seeing as you 2 practically are," grumbled Ron. The twins looked over at him, surprise on their features, before they bounded over to their brother and linked hands with him in a circle and began bounding in a loop of extremely altered ring around the rosy. "We didn't think you'd notice, ickle Ronnie Kins." They chanted together gleefully before sandwiching their brother in a hug. "Ickle Ronnie is so observant, isn't he?" Fred simpered to George who nodded. "He's grown so much. I'm so proud," George coddled, faking tears welling in his eyes. "Oh, lay off," growled Ron, shoving the twins away, his ears turning red with embarrassment. "But seriously," Harry said, staring at the twins, "was it really that obvious?" George shook his head in resignation and Fred sighed and looked at the ceiling in a way that suggests, "What on earth am I going to do with this boy?" Harry just stared at the 2 of them, waiting for an answer. "Harry, when we passed you," began George. "You have the most ridiculous look on your face," continued Fred. "And Cedric was wearing this look that, well, pretty much had, I want to take advantage of this innocent being, written all over face." Harry's jaw dropped in surprise and Ron started laughing, bracing himself on his bed to keep from falling. The twins just smiled. "Honestly, anyone who looked at your two and actually looked would have seen it," said George simply while Fred, next to him, held up his hands with an expression saying, "Well, what'd ya expect?" Harry sighed and flopped back onto his bed. Ron, having recovered from laughing and flopped down next to Harry, though sitting. "So, did you have fun tonight? I mean, hearing Fred and George," the twins snickered, "is one thing, but I was too busy trying to help Neville to see how you were doing." Harry nodded, remember seeing his two fellow fourth years struggling. "Yeah," he replied, smiling lightly and glancing away briefly before continuing. "I guess I did. I actually enjoyed it somewhat." Ron grinned at him. "Oh come on." Harry scoffed at him. "You can enjoy dancing, can't you? Or is it forbidden for men to like dancing?" "Harry," sniggered George, "I dunno if I'd call you a man yet. More of adolescent sex boy," elaborated Fred, smiling thoughtfully and squinting at the ceiling, a manic glint in his eyes. "Who just happens to have a fox trailing him desperately," Ron finished, and flushed epilogue. Ethically when Harry shot a scathing look in his direction. "An adolescent sex boy," Harry repeated to the twins, raising his eyebrows in skepticism. They both turned to him, leering, and, as quickly as they had moved before, Harry now found them both on either side of him, uncomfortably close. Fred reached out and stroked his face gently and said softly, "Would you rather just be a regular adolescent boy?" As George ran a hand up his back to play with the back of his hair. Harry's eyes widened and he felt himself go stiff, suddenly feeling very awkward. Ron had scooted a few feet away on the bed and was gaping blankly at the scene in front of him. "Because that'd be such a shame, Harry," George purred against the shell of his ear as Fred continued to gently caress the contours of his face. "Why let such a gem as you go unnoticed? Especially when it's so delectable." George winked and Fred stuck out his tongue and they both quickly wrapped their arms around Harry and yanked him back to lie on the bed between them. Simultaneously they both whined out, "Why does Diggory get to have all the fun?" before bursting out laughing at Harry and Ron's expressions and finally releasing the raven-haired fourth year. After a moment of recovery, Harry scooted back farther onto the bed away from where the twins were now sitting and laughing. "I'm never trusting you two ever again," he said, still slightly shaky from the moment before and trying to calm his breathing. George leaned his head back so that he was looking at Harry upside down with a lopsided grin. "Whatever gave you the impression you could ever trust us?" "Honestly, Harry," Fred continued, leaning back to rest on his twin. "Have we ever truly given you reason to trust us?" As Harry attempted to give some sort of proof the twins were not molesters and actually relatively decent, Ron has somewhat recovered his ability to function and was breathing heavily with his eyes shut tightly, as if trying to calm himself down before he began to beat his two brothers. "You two," he managed out, eyes still closed. "Out. Now. No more molesting. Go." The twins seemed to have had their fill of entertainment at the expense of their brother and his best friend and got up and waltzed out of the dorm, still grinning deviously. "Give Cedric our love, Harry," they called together as the door shut behind them. Ron suddenly made a flurry of movement and managed to send his shoe flying across the room to smack loudly against the door. Still breathing heavily he turned to Harry, shock and apology shining on his face. "I swear I'm not related to them," he rasped out, shaking his head slightly as he plumped down onto his bed and put his face in his hands. "I knew they were a bit wonky but, Merlin, that was just, wow." Harry sighed and quickly collected himself and managed to smile at his best friend. "Don't worry about it," he said, shrugging and stretching his shoulders to release any tension. "Besides, they seem too involved with each other to bother with me." Ron let out a frustrated sort of gurgle and rubbed his hands furiously through his hair making it resemble Harry's. He looked up with a sort of lopsided grin. "And that could have passed for a grimace as well. I honestly don't know what is wrong with my family. They all seem to be obsessed with you." Harry raised an eyebrow and Ron's ears turned red. "Obsessed with me?" Ron ran a hand through his hair again, making it messier than before even inside. "Well, Ginny's always been a fan. Percy wants to use you to get to the top of everything, and now it seems even the twins are interested. I just really don't want to know their agenda." Harry felt someone gently stirring him from his sleep and groggily blinked his eyes open to look up at the person waking him. Emerald eyes met stormy gray as Cedric's face swam into focus. Harry blinked again, this time in surprise, and stared up at the older boy. "Cedric," he stammered out. "What are you doing here?" Cedric smiled warmly at him and wrapped his arms around Harry, who only just realized that the other boy was lying next to him in bed, nestled under the covers and sheets. Harry blushed at the situation, and even more when Cedric began to trace lazy patterns on his back. "Waking up with you, obviously," the seventh year replied and buried his face in Harry's hair, breathing deeply. Harry was still, trying to keep his heartbeat from racing when he felt another pair of arms wrap around him from behind him, and he jumped in surprise, quickly looking over his shoulder to come face to face with Fred Weasley, who was smiling. "Sleep well, kitten," he purred out deviously. Harry fumbled for words and turned back to look at Cedric, only to find he was no longer there and that instead it was George facing him. Wearing a predatory grin as he began to run his hands along Harry's sides, making the raven squirm uncomfortably. "You're even more delectable when you squirm for us," George said seductively, moving closer to Harry. Harry quickly squeezed his eyes shut and tried to stop his mind from working, tried to make the others go away, trying to brace himself for the twins to do whatever they were planning. It never came. Harry remained frozen with his eyes firmly shut for a moment before cracking them slightly. Cedric was gone. The twins were gone. Harry found himself alone in bed and sighed in relief. He rolled over onto his back, relaxing slightly and staring calmly up at gentle blue sky. He felt his eyes beginning to drift shut when he felt a lazy arm flop across his chest and a warm body nestle next to him. Snuggling slightly, Harry blinked lazily and looked over at the new being. Soft white blonde hair greeted his vision, and the fragile form of another boy he vaguely recognized slept gently against him. The gentle rise and fall of the other boy's shoulders indicated a soft sleep, and Harry smiled contentedly, feeling slightly protective of the person nestled against him. Harry reached out and gently brushed the wisps of hair from the other face, wishing to see the boy's face and discover if it was as beautiful as the rest of him. The sleeping boy shifted and turned his face slightly, sighing comfortably as he snuggled closer to Harry. Harry gasped silently as the hair fell away from the other boy's sleeping face as he turned toward Harry. The face turned toward Harry was gentle and calm, well sculpted and with fine and delicate features. A small straight nose swept down from two lightly resting eyelids and beautifully curving brows. His mouth was set in a relaxed smile. Harry stared, captivated by the other boy sleeping close to him. Swallowing with difficulty, he tried to get his body to relax. The boy suddenly stirred and blinked groggily, his eyes first alighting on Harry's torso, then traveling upward to connect with Harry's gaze. Silvery pools, still swimming with sleep, gazed into Harry's own emerald eyes, and everything froze. The boy blinked once, the sleep clearing as confusion began to cloud his eyes. "Potter," he said, furrowing his brows as he gazed up at Harry. Harry swallowed yet again, forcing his throat to work, and continued to look into those eyes. Licking his lips in preparation, he replied in the only manner that he knew, "Malfoy." Malfoy continued to gaze up at him in confusion, still lying close to him with his pale arm stretched across Harry's chest. Harry tried to ignore the proximity of the other and instead focused on breathing and not doing anything drastic. Malfoy seemed to have noticed Harry's anxiety, and he raised his hand not across Harry and gently brushed Harry's bangs from his face, revealing his lightning bolt scar for a moment before his hair fell back to shield it. Harry's eyes widened at the act and his breath hitched. Malfoy smiled softly, as he had been doing when asleep, and continued to stroke Harry's hair. Harry stared in amazement as the blonde gently brushed his hair and smiled up at him. His stomach was churning with something he knew wasn't hunger, and his heart beginning to speed up every second that Malfoy continued to gaze into his eyes. A sudden noise made Harry jerk his gaze from Malfoy's face and look to the foot of the bed. Crimson eyes stared at him from a sickly white face with slits for nostrils and a cruel smiling mouth. Harry felt his blood run cold and the sensation of being mashed in the chest, and he was careening down into drowning darkness. Harry sat bolt upright, breathing heavily and feeling cold sweat on his skin. Gasping for breath and trying to remember the dream he had been having, he glanced around. The light coming in from the tower window suggesting it was just after sunrise. Feeling slightly more calm, he lay back on the bed and tried to remember what he had been dreaming about. However, as soon as he tried to grasp a part of it, it seemed to evade his consciousness, and after a while, he simply gave up. Rolling over to face the day, Harry squinted out the window, pouring in the vague morning rays of sunlight. He sighed, remembering tomorrow was the end of the week and he could finally find some relaxation from his recent problems. Rolling back onto his back, he stretched his arms over his head, pondering what he would do once classes ended for the day. A sudden noise caused Harry to jerk his attention back to the window. A small black owl was hovering at the glass, tapping in mid-flight to get in. Harry quickly hurried to let the small bird in and relieve it of its burden in the form of a small envelope secured at its leg. Having delivered the letter, the small bird flew swiftly from the room and back into the cold dawn. Curiously, Harry noted the letter to be for him in a vaguely familiar script. Hesitantly, he opened the envelope and let the parchment slip out to fall into his waiting hands. "Harry, I hope if you ever get mauled by bears." That was all it said, with a few scribbles and completely blacked out words. There was no signature on the letter. It was honestly the weirdest thing he had ever received in a letter. If this was some sort of code, he was completely floored as to what it could mean, aside from gruesome animal attacks. He tried to think of someone who would have written the letter but could think of none. Sighing, Harry folded up the letter and placed it in the photo album of his parents, which resided in his bedside table for future thought. Confirming he wouldn't get any more sleep with the dawn streaming in now through the window, Harry reluctantly pulled himself from bed to shower before breakfast. His mind quickly changed, however, when upon entering the bathroom Harry caught sight of the twins, whispering to each other. Upon hearing him enter, they turned to him, getting matching grins on their features. He promptly turned around and left, deciding to instead take a shower later. Feeling there was nothing better to do, he quickly dressed and went down to breakfast. The hall was unusually deserted from what Harry was accustomed to. However, it being so early, this didn't strike him as odd. Yawning slightly, Harry made his way to the Gryffindor table and plopped down in front of an appealing row of toast. Selecting a piece and spreading marmalade on it, Harry glanced up briefly to see who was around. A few feet from him was what looked like a slumped-over person. They appeared to be face down on the table and were unmoving save for the slight rise and fall of breathing. Harry furrowed his brows as he studied the unconscious person, trying to remember who had hair that blonde in Gryffindor. More out of early morning stupidity and curiosity than actual interest, Harry picked up a crust of toast from his plate and tossed it at the slumped person. It hit the other square on the side of the head, bouncing off and leaving a few crumbs. Smiling in amusement like a young child, Harry waited for a reaction. The other figure didn't move. Harry waited for a few more minutes. Nothing. Slightly disappointed, Harry turned back to his marmalade and toast. A second later something hit him rather harshly on the side of the face. Jumping in shock, Harry quickly spun around, looking for the attacker. No one else was in the hall save for an extremely bleary-eyed Ravenclaw who seemed to be confused about the milk jug. Confused, Harry looked back down at the table to see what had been thrown at him. His crust of toast lay about a foot from his plate. Apprehensively, Harry reached out to pick it up. It was definitely his toast. He quickly looked at the slumped figure. It hadn't moved. Feeling slightly bemused, Harry turned back to his toast, the other crust still held lightly in his hand. Absently, he reached for the coffee pot. He froze as his hand closed on the handle, and another hand. Hesitantly, Harry looked up to see who had hold of the coffee pot. The slumped figure had moved. It had extended an arm to grab the coffee pot which Harry was also currently holding. Harry gave an experimental tug. He was met with an extremely strong and forceful tug, startling him and, with a yelp, he launched from his seat to extend halfway across the table, now only about 2 feet from the slumped figure. As the figure raised its head, Harry realized why he was having a hard time placing the student. He wasn't from Gryffindor. He also wasn't from Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw. Harry stared dumbly at Draco Malfoy as the other boy glared at him those slightly bloodshot eyes. After a moment, the morning silence was broken. "My coffee." Harry took a moment to realize Malfoy had just spoken. Raising an eyebrow, Harry gave a very small tug on the pot. Malfoy glared and tightened his grip. "Mine," he growled from clenched teeth. "Share," Harry suggested. It seemed that at this hour in the morning the two reverted to childlike conversational tactics. Malfoy shook his head, still glaring at Harry. "Please," Harry added. Malfoy seemed to consider him for a moment, before looking to the coffee pot, back at Harry. And then resting his gaze on the pot, debating. After a moment he seemed to come to a conclusion and, ignoring or not registering Harry's grip on the pot, tipped the coffee into the mug closest to him, filling it to the brim with steaming coffee. Seemingly satisfied, he leaned forward and, not even bothering to pick it up, slurped a substantial amount of coffee from the mug. Harry watched in fascinated horror as Malfoy grinned foolishly, his eyes drooping, before the Slytherin slumped sideways on the table, arms still outstretched and gripping the coffee pot. Harry stared at Malfoy in disbelief as the other boy's chest slowly rose and fell. It seemed Malfoy had actually fallen asleep again. Feeling somewhat annoyed, Harry released his hold on the coffee pot, giving it up as a lost battle, and went back to his toast, brooding over the lack of coffee. A second later he stared in shock as the cup in front of him slowly filled with the black liquid and he slowly raised his head to stare at Malfoy, who was in mid-yawn and about 6 inches from his face, seemingly having left his seat and traveled to Harry's side of the table and begun to pour him coffee in about 12 seconds without Harry noticing. Malfoy finished pouring the coffee and then finished yawning, his eyes drooping dangerously again. Harry watched apprehensively as Malfoy clumsily put down the pot of coffee. Suddenly the blonde slumped into Harry. With a slight squeak, Harry tried to lean out of the way, but instead found himself with an armful of Slytherin, again asleep and unexpectedly Evie leaning against Harry as he sat and struggled to throw him off. "Get off." Harry spat through his grimace as he attempted to shove Malfoy off of him. Malfoy said nothing and instead slipped to Saint half of the bench and half into Harry. The Gryffindor felt his face being to burn as he stared incredulously at the blonde currently snuggling into his lap. After the moment of shock, Harry's limbs seemed to understand the situation and began flailing and attempting to shove Malfoy off. "Get off. Get off, you stupid git!" Harry half yelled, fuming. Leaning backwards and pushing with all his might, Harry managed to finally shove Malfoy off of him. The other boy wobbled up, somewhat sitting, before cracking his eyes, still half asleep, seeing Harry, and falling back towards him. "No!" Harry yelled, jutting out his arms and holding the wavering Malfoy at bay. "No! No lap for you. Go back to your own table." Malfoy's head lolled to face Harry, and his eyes opened slowly. Harry watched, bracing himself, as Malfoy blinked a few times, eyes still drowned in sleep. Malfoy's gaze traveled up and down Harry before finally resting back on his emerald eyes. The eyes squinted in confusion. "Harry," Malfoy quietly said, obviously confused. Harry stared. Since when had they been on a first-name basis? "Potter," Harry supplied, trying to bring things back to reality and away from Malfoy addressing him informally and sleeping on him. Malfoy blinked at him. He sighed, closed his eyes, and leaned heavily against Harry's arms, and Harry grit his teeth with the effort of keeping the other propped up. "Harry," Malfoy repeated sleepily. Harry was finding the task of keeping Malfoy propped up becoming extremely tiring and his arms began to ache. Suddenly Malfoy reached out and grabbed Harry, pulling him towards the Slytherin and crushing the two of them together as Harry yelped and struggled frantically trying to break from the pair of arms attempting to clamp around him and stop movement. "Let go," he yelled, getting an arm loose and flailing it about, trying to release the other. A moment too late, Harry realized the consequences of his failing out to the side as he and Malfoy began to lean dangerously off the bench toward the floor. "No," Harry began, flinging his arm around the other direction to grab the table and finding it very inconveniently far away as he tilted farther and farther. "No, no, no. No, 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 Nag." Quote. With a loud flump the two boys tumbled to the floor in a tangle of limbs, Malfoy pulling Harry closer to him and Harry clawing desperately with his free hand with a pained expression on his face. After his 20th attempt to grapple with the floor, Harry gave up, breathing heavily on the floor, Malfoy's arms still firmly clamped around his waist. Looking down at the blonde, Harry scowled, trying to shift his hips and legs in order to kick the Slytherin off him, but no use, the other boy was lying on top of those as well. Exasperated, Harry allowed his head to roll back onto the floor to rest, his eyes scanning around for people. Of course, as if to add to his troubles, the one person he least wanted to see was walking along the staff table, wearing an amused smirk. "Good morning, Potter." Quote. Harry gulped, extremely aware of his position at the moment. "Good morning, Professor. May I inquire as to what is going on?" Professor Snape drawled out, the smirk still tugging at his mouth. Harry tried to swallow, finding words extremely difficult at the moment. "Morning exercises," he supplied, trying his best not to leave a question at the end of his sentence. Snape smirked. "I see," he said, black eyes glinting. Without saying anything more, Snape turned and glided out of the Great Hall. Harry watched him leave, catching sight of the sky outside. It didn't seem like much time had passed since the sky was still pale. Scowling, Harry dispassionately poked at Malfoy, causing the boy to squirm somewhat as he lay on Harry's abdomen. Feeling there was nothing else he could do in this position, Harry poked slightly harder. Malfoy twitched unhappily. Harry grinned in spite of himself. He prodded Malfoy sharply and he jerked, trying to escape the unwanted touches. Harry was about to prod him again when Malfoy looked up at him, scowling somewhat and slightly less bleary-eyed. "Harry Potter," Harry immediately supplied. It seemed they had begun a game of collaboratively completing Harry's name over and over. Malfoy's eyes seemed to clear for a moment, and he began to blink furiously, before raising a hand and rubbing at his face feverishly. Harry watched him, wondering if he was actually waking up. After a moment or two, Malfoy looked back at Harry. "Why am I lying on top of you, Potter?" Harry almost laughed in happiness. Malfoy read at his look of happiness in disbelief and confusion. "You called me Potter," Harry answered his look. "When do I not?" Harry was about to reply, thought better of it, and simply shook his head. What are you doing?" Harry stammered out 5 minutes later, still shocked at the Slytherin's close proximity and appearance at a table which wasn't his own. "Looking at you," Malfoy responded. Harry blinked at him, missing the insincerity of the answer. Malfoy sighed and returned to a standing position. "I'm bored and no one is around. Then you showed up. What are you doing so early, Potter?" Harry scoffed and, having composed himself, took a bite of toast. After chewing, he replied, "I could ask you the same." Crabbe fell out of bed. Shook the whole room. "Once I'm awake I have a hard time going back to sleep." Harry watched Malfoy for a moment, disbelieving that the blonde was being so open with him. When Malfoy seemed to pay no heed to this, Harry leaned back and studied him. "Something interest you, Potter?" Malfoy inquired, noting Harry's scrutinizing look. "The fact that you're not being hostile and trying to hex me," Harry replied simply. "And you're telling me about your personal life." Malfoy yawned. "It's early. I don't function well in the mornings. I'm practically delusional right now." Harry, in spite of himself, almost smiled. "I see." Malfoy stretched and snatched a piece of toast himself, biting into it casually. "In fact, for all I know, I am hallucinating and talking to air and not you, making me look quite ridiculous. However, as long as there's coffee and toast, at the moment I don't care." He chewed passively and rested his elbows on the table, slouching somewhat. It was the first time Harry had ever seen Malfoy actually act passive and nonchalant, actually slouching. Which was something he never did. "You sure it was Crabbe who fell out of bed and not you? Maybe you hit your head or something." "Aha," Malfoy drawled, taking another bite of toast and using it to gesture at Harry. "See, if I had fallen out of bed, I would have a great horrible lump on my head from where it collided with the floor. As far as I can observe, I have no such lump. Also, you have now mentioned it. On top of that, I now know I am hallucinating, because the Potter I know would have never asked me that sort of question so casually and shown the slightest concern in my well-being. Therefore, I am, in fact, delusional." Harry stared at the Slytherin as he continued to munch on his toast, gazing at Harry with a sort of distant expression on his face. Finishing the toast, Malfoy leaned back, brushed off his hands, folding his arms on the table, and, quite literally, slumped over to rest his head. Harry stared in amazement and horrified shock as the blonde appeared to begin to take a cat nap on the table of his opposing house. "Oi," Harry said loudly, picking up a piece of toast and throwing it at the blonde. "Go to your own table to sleep." Malfoy ignored him. Harry huffed, stood up, grumbling to himself, and walked around the table so he was standing near the Slytherin. Feeling exasperated, Harry pointedly jabbed the Slytherin in the side with his foot. Malfoy grumbled and picked up the piece of toast Harry had thrown at him and hurled it at Harry's head. Harry dodged it easily and kicked Malfoy again. "Go back to your own table," Harry snapped, low, seeing his patience and feeling the lack of sleep crawl up on him. Malfoy grumbled but finally got up and staggered across the hall to his own table, where he promptly collapsed next to a giant pot of coffee. Harry sat back down and picked up his forgotten toast, every now and then glancing across the hall to see if Malfoy had moved from his slumped position on Slytherin table. He half contemplated hurling another crust of toast across the hall to see if it would entice a reaction, but thought better of it when Professor Snape entered the hall and sat down at the staff table yet again, beady black. Eyes surveying the great hall over his morning pastry. That's it for today, I will stop here. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you please consider subscribe and make sure to hit that like button, share with your friends, and don't forget to check out author of this story. Details in description.